And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, I am joined tonight by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it looks like on this Saturday night, I guess you could say it's the culmination of a week of naked aggression by the deep state and the Biden regime against a large chunk of the populace and through the figure of President Donald Trump. Now, we're going to go into the roots tonight in this special report dealing specifically with the classified UFO information and its ties to the real reason behind a lot of this activity and a lot of those links that include Trump, his uncle, President Nixon, John F. Kennedy, and a very interesting group operating in the background, trying to make sure that a lot of this X technology never sees the light of day through extreme control and extreme building blocks in the wall of secrecy. Of course, we're going to go a couple hours tonight, and for the second half of the broadcast, we'll be taking your questions, which you can ask those right up front. So before I jump in, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Everyone is very grateful for a show, and Ivan Langley said, "Glad to be among other great people." That is the vibe.
Ivan gets the quote there. Absolutely. That's so I've noticed in the ideas room, whenever the show's over, and I always tell Olivia this, there's like go over the chat specifically, every little drop in there. And it's very interesting because the ideas that we all exchange, I think, take everything up to a higher level because no one's as smart as all of us. And we're going to find that out tonight. And we're going to find it out through some interesting whistleblowers and some interesting new facts that are breaking in the Trump case as well. But it's not so much focused on the legal sort of minutia of what's going on there, although that is interesting as well. I think we did some coverage on that with Dr. Joseph Farrell, and we have a part 2 coming up with him as well. What I'm going to show tonight is that pathway to the advanced technology through the figure of Professor John G. Trump from MIT, stone's throw from us here in Harvard Square, maybe about 10 minutes. And some very unusual things that we covered in relation to John Trump back in 2018, which are now coming to fruition more and more as we learn things about this raid involving President Trump. And, I can say this for the record after reviewing the case over a couple of days, which is the idea of an administration prosecuting its rival for the presidency is unheard of and is an impeachable offense across the board for the attorney general, for the justices involved, and certainly for the president who instigated the entire matter, although he hides behind the idea, well, Merrick Garland just went off and did this on his own. Originally, they weren't even going to give Merrick Garland. They were going to be like, oh, it's just the FBI went off on this crazy wackadoo thing. We're going to find, of course, the credibility of the FBI, especially during the Trump years, was at an all-time low. They participated in a number of frauds, including the Steele dossier. They had intense favoritism towards Hillary Clinton, showing that they were in the pocket of the neocon militarization group, the empire building group that wants to go in there and take on Russia and bomb the Middle East and do all that. These are things which, they go across the political spectrum, and they involve military investment and how the country has been set up since World War II. Now, a lot of other countries have these problems too, but we're addressing the structural problem in the United States with the deep state. It goes global. Russia has their own issues. China certainly has their own issues, and they're trying to infiltrate and control what goes on here in America. And so we have to take a lot of this in context. But what we see operational is this kind of war economy. And the better we can get a handle on it and cut it off, the more enlightened we'll be as a society. But we'll also come to realize that a number of things that they throw at us in terms of these emergencies to seize emergency powers because their numbers are so low and too low to govern are particularly important for us to be aware of. And so if we understand that history of how this situation got here, we can take this constitutional republic on a much different path, the path that I believe the founders set it on back there in 1776. And we should be much further along, of course, going back now 59 years, almost 60 years on the Kennedy assassination. That is another derailment of our progress. So we're going in a totally different direction, and then somebody changes the rules right in the middle of the game. And that somebody, we're going to see over and over again, relates to this international body. And I like to describe this, the deep state, I think, as Professor Scott really caught something by using this term. And we're going to understand things by looking at them through the prism of deep research along that line, that there are groups that are concerned with policy changes. And those groups will step into the public light from behind the scenes, cause those policy changes, and then revert back to the shadows, leaving us with the debris in these deep events from the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11, the 2008 financial coup d'etat, the COVID op, the whole gambit. So we're looking at a series of them, and we have to get our handle on the players. And one of the key things that they have on deck is the buildup to this UFO threat via the Central Intelligence Agency and their control over the subject in the media since 2017, unfortunately aided by many able-bodied UFO researchers who fell right in line with their plans. And so we have phony whistleblowers and people of this nature coming in, and the media closing in on this UFO subject and making it acceptable, but only in the CIA UFO threat version. So that's a very dangerous situation, and it gets us into things that we cover in this program, including emergency powers through the continuity of government program. So the history tonight of Professor John Trump and his mentor, Professor Vannevar Bush, and the lineage of the UFO file coming through into the figure of President Trump, and then the situation that we find ourselves in that development of the battle over the UFO file, which included Space Force and which included the To the Stars Academy, CIA op. These things have to be looked at in a direct light, and we need to kind of catch up here drastically. These are things that we've been covering for a long time, and we came forward with a lot of information relating to breaking the story of President Trump's deep relationship with President Nixon, the late President Nixon. And when we came up with that story, everyone was like, oh, no, there was one letter a long time ago and nothing. And I had found so much evidence of a deep relationship between the two. In September of 2020, all the media came out because the Nixon Museum released there's hundreds of letters between Trump and Nixon showing that deep, decades-long relationship. And that's a major key if we want to understand things like Mar-a-Lago, for example, if we want to understand how Trump came into office so well poised about the political process. And if we want to understand the lineage of characters like Roger Stone, who, of course, was in charge of Young Republicans for Nixon in 1972, but also was a major advisor and a targeted advisor for President Trump in 2016, a campaign advisor. And, of course, he got mixed up in the whole Mueller, circus, and they were going to send him to prison. So Trump had to pardon him. Interestingly enough, in that raid, they, in fact, grabbed some documents relating to Trump's pardon of Stone, which I find significant, and it's going to take us into the territory of hidden archives. And what I call in this program stealth archives, which we're going to understand very well if we go back even to the very beginning of this series, because a good example of a stealth archive would be something that's out there that it exists, and the idea is that, the public is aware of it, so therefore we've satisfied the demand, but no one can see it. So the JFK records, for example, those records have been sitting there for 59 years. They were supposed to be, by law, opened up in 2017, and they continue to be locked down. So it's a stealth archive because we know it exists. It's a reality. It's not somebody's theory. Those documents are there. Even the government agrees, but you and I can't see them. I can give you a series of examples along this line, but it's very important because, again, just like what's happening with the affidavit in this case of President Trump being raided, letting out the documents and the warrant that they let out doesn't really tell us a whole lot. There's a few interesting items, but obviously it's the affidavit of how they got the warrant that is the key crucial aspect. And we're going to get into that tonight as well, because if they claim, oh, we had an FBI source and he knew this stuff was there, or where did they get this information from? Very important. Let's look at the whole situation with the National Archives, which was the kind of MacGuffin for this whole thing to get them through the door. This idea that the National Archives guy on a TV screen saw Trump leaving office and said, oh, what's in those trunks? And that's what set this whole thing off, going back to February of 2021. I'm going to tell you an interesting history of this national archivist, which is he is also the person who received the Merritt Nixon time capsule letter. And I'm going to show you those letters, and I'm going to show you his responses to President Trump. So we have a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to do my best in a couple hours. And, if you want to go deep, folks, tonight is deep because, of course, once we get into John G. Trump, we get into Nikola Tesla and Tesla's papers and what the government attempted to do with them, hiding them. And the raid on Tesla's papers has an incredible similarity to the raid on Mar-a-Lago, and there's a reason for that. So we're going to get into all that tonight. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That is going to keep us in touch with each other, in lieu of all this incredible social media censorship that we're seeing, which is really beyond the pale. And, it's an absurdity. It's one of those obvious absurdities we learn to live with now, It's like the whole, hey, men can get pregnant. No, they can't. So, we're living under these strange times, and the idea is they're trying to fit our mental pattern, our brain patterns to these new, bizarre ways of thinking because they have something in mind and they need to do it quickly. I think they figured out that the longer they wait, the less control they have. And that's part of it, but there may be some other aspects involved also. In any case, that newsletter, which is a free newsletter, keeps us in touch, and it's the perfect way for us to have a pipeline going with each other. And like I said, on the second half of the program, we'll take questions tonight. Keep those questions coming in, Miss Olivia. We'll get them together. We got a lot to cover. And before I go in deep, Miss Olivia, hit it up.
I did not have a chance to discuss this with you, but I listened to the astrologer Pam Gregory's new report today, and she discussed a Sabian symbol, is what they're called, about this. It's about 19 degrees and in Taurus. And what it represents is a new continent rising out of the ocean.
Wow. Well, that's going to be very helpful for the next Hot Zone episode. Mm-hmm. So yeah, remember to send me that one. I want to hear it. Very interesting. And we know astrology becomes more and more important during periods like this, and not the frivolous kind of horoscope type thing, but there is a deeper relevance. And I think that astrology is starting to see its way in all that, in a public fashion. But I've always had some different levels of respect for it because I've actually known people who were involved with it, and just a great study from all the mystery schools, the true astrology. And, very often the mystery schools say, well, astrology is a witnessing. It is something where, these things are in a certain particular place because you are coming through these realms. So people have come through different planetary realms. When they come back, those planets are in a kind of a witnessing pattern. So instead of, it being about, hey, you lose your free will and astrology just decides everything, it's more about the opportunities that you have while you're here. And so that's the way I view astrology. It's kind of interesting, the different takes on it. And I've always looked at Western astrology. It's very interesting, although I know there's, what is it, Ayurvedic astrology and all kinds of
Vedic.
Vedic, mm-hmm. Yes. So we have all kinds of traditions there in the East around it as well. And of course, the three wise men, right? What were they doing following a star? Those were some of the best astrologers on the planet. So that's, I think, where people who come from a deep faith can still get into things along these lines. It's a kind of esoteric Christianity, I guess you could say. All right, go for it.
No, there's the Saturday night is pornbot night.
Oh,
so
no.
they have already begun.
Yeah, well, the flooding of the chat with these robots becomes really something kind of crazy. But I will say this, that we have a great crowd in here tonight, and we're very pleased to be with you here on this Saturday. Okay, let's go back in time. Let's go back to the 1930s. And we're going to be looking at MIT for someone who's running the MIT Lodge, the Mason Lodge there. And he is a very, very innovative scientist by the name of Vannevar Bush. Now, Vannevar Bush is going to be somebody who has a major impact on history, whether you're talking about the development of computers and the internet, or if you're talking about the control of the UFO file for decades. And as a trusted confidant of 5 different presidents, this is somebody who played a major role in history. And one of his key proteges along the way was an electrical engineer named John Trump, who had come here from New York. And his family was very, very interesting, had an interesting background. And his brother got into real estate. And of course, that is Trump's father. But John took this path of going deep on the astrology side. Well, I guess it wasn't astrology, was it? But he went so scientific, I guess, that he went off the charts, because by the time he's working with DeGraff and all of these people, he really has an unusually advanced futuristic sense about him for the early 1930s. And when we think back and look at the work that he got involved with, we can see that his connection with Vannevar Bush is the big key to how he gets these major positions, which I believe include working very closely on the UFO file. And I'm going to show you some of that tonight. The fact that he was close with his nephew, Donald Trump, is also quite remarkable. And President Trump, on a number of occasions, spelled out that relationship. And I'm going to show tonight how he spelled it out and said, in relation to John, he knew nuclear before nuclear, which is very interesting considering the whole nuclear spin that they've been trying to put on these documents and the whole National Archives MacGuffin that they're using to try to ensnare Trump in a legal case, which is politically driven. When we look at John Trump, one of the things that jumps out at you is the number of patents that the man created. He was an electrical genius, and he was somebody who worked very hard during World War II to help keep the secrecy around the atomic project, and was in fact part of what they call the RAD lab at MIT, which was under the control of the heavily secrecy conscious Vannevar Bush. That secrecy would come in very handy when the UFO file came more to the fore during the 1940s. And all that secrecy that had been developed through his Masonic work would be transferred directly to the Manhattan Project, and then from there to the UFO file. So we have to kind of get that historic lineage and also understand the figure of Vannevar Bush. Now, Vannevar Bush is identified in Majestic 12 documents as the person who was in charge of the UFO file. But for people who don't even believe that, on record, the top physicist in the United States, or one of the top, certainly right up there with Oppenheimer, someone named Robert Sarbarker. And Sarbarker went into great depths on 2 different occasions, once in 1950 and once in 1984. And in 1984, he revealed to a researcher that, in fact, we had a UFO redevelopment program, and we had gone through a number of stages with it. This is very important because it's not somebody's theoretical concept. It's on the record by one of the top physicists in the United States. This physicist would be kind of whitewashed, you might say, eliminated from history to a degree. There are echoes around about him, but he's largely whitewashed. And as I've pointed out many times, there isn't even a Wikipedia page for Robert Sarbarker. That's really extraordinary because this guy was on the cover of Saturday Evening Post, the big physicist, innovator, and was really just as big as Oppenheimer during the 1940s and early 50s. Some of the projects dealing with electromagnetics that John Trump was working on at MIT, still not very well explained and very, very unusual. And we learned that Trump became the secretary of the Microwave Committee in 1942. And what's interesting is around this time, he will meet with MIT President Carl Compton. One of the things that Sarbarker, the physicist, revealed about the UFO file is there is a lineage of who took over. And so for a long time, probably a good 15 years, we had Vannevar Bush. But then it all got turned over to Compton. And then from Compton, it went to John von Neumann, who was also deeply involved in the atomic project. These are important threads because we understand the level of secrecy they needed to work on the atomic project. Then they're going to need that and beyond. And in fact, Sarbarker will tell us that the atomic bomb was listed as highly top secret, but that the UFO file was listed above it, the top national security secret of the United States, the UFO file in 1950, and probably just as high or higher right now. So we need to understand that as good background when we're getting into the political persecution of a person, and we're looking at Trump on a different level than just, well, he's the conservative one, and he's the one who's battling for America first, and all these types of things. It's all true. And we also can take him as the political opponent of a system that's trying to move in rapidly with the transhumanist program, which is not something that Trump is very much about. He's more of the old school version of, America being great, and he's not so much of an empire builder. He's all about the big deals, and there's a certain type of business first quality with these people. But America and the world has always done better when we've had this type of leadership. It has its own problems, and it needs to be expanded, the vision of these types. But they're very conscious of individuals, and they're very conscious of that freedom principle. And I think when we get to this idea of a kind of global communism, global fascist move, it's all about getting the freedoms that have been out there and worked on by people for over 240 years and reversing that process and putting the genie back in the bottle. And it's such a losing venture, but it's a very dangerous venture when the people involved have the resources that they have, especially in terms of advanced weaponry. So we need to look at these things on a few different levels. When we look at Trump, we need to look at him as more than this political symbol. We need to see, what are his connections? What did he do while he was in office? Well, one of the very interesting things that he did was he created the Space Force. And the Space Force, if you look at it in the proper fashion with the UFO file in mind, you're going to see it's a direct attempt to pull that UFO file back under executive control from where it was lost somewhere between the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations. Kennedy's presidency can also be looked at as getting this large exotic technology wing back under the control of the executive branch. That's very crucial. Instead, it's been operating in a strange corridor of defense contractors of the aerospace variety and the intelligence agencies and their masters, which go far beyond government organizations. And so there's no real representative there of the public. It is a complete whitewash. And so the groups that we've worked on and taken a look at and done the research on, I've called X-Protect, and those are the groups that protect this type of information. So when we're looking at this, we have to understand that there's an active group who suppresses the information, who puts a spin on the information, and ultimately influences the researchers, especially those who make major breakthroughs. And going all the way back to the 1950s up until today, these groups are every bit as active. Sometimes they're very active at silencing the whole scene, and other times they're involved with putting a spin on it, making it like we see now, the whole CIA disclosure version. that version is so dangerous, and that they attach it to the National Defense Authorization Act is also very dangerous. So if that whole process is subverted by a figure like Trump, who's aware of the UFO file through his uncle, through his family connections, then we're dealing with a totally different situation than your typical right-left fight. And we have to go far beyond that. Everything we've seen in the last 5 years goes far beyond the traditional right-left fight, which, that fight goes all the way back to the 1930s. When we think about it, this fight is now between a slavery transhumanism and the control of every move versus fundamental freedom. And so are you going to be slave or are you going to be free becomes the question. And the more the pile-on goes, when they identify people who have large-scale followings, have enough charisma and money and all the rest, and have proven that they can win the presidency and what they'll do when they get there, these aren't people that the deep state can afford to have come around and make them wait for 4 years again. Now, we have to remember Trump's presidency was also marred by a series of strange investigations trying to pin him as the person involved in Russia collusion, the Steele dossier, all these things which turned out to be falling completely flat on their face, including the fact that Trump supposedly tried to get a foreign government to influence negatively his political rival. Well, this is exactly what Biden is doing out in the open, only he's using the FBI. This was an impeachment proceeding, which the Democrats lost against Trump for the second time. So, their thing was just, let's slow him down. Let's get him involved in court cases. Let's put him in impeachment proceedings. Let's harass him in the media. Let's not help him do his job, but we won't let him do his job. Now, when we look at this, we can say no figure in history who was a president ever experienced this kind of opposition. If you go back and look at Nixon's opposition, and that's like the Vietnam War and all the divisions over that, it does not rise to the level of what Trump had to take in the media. So, rather than looking at it and saying, well, I like Trump or I don't like Trump, let's forget about all that. What are they doing? Who's involved in the targeting? What's the targeting for? Where does it lead us? And if you go on the exotic technology front, and if you go into the UFO file and the X technology, the answers exist there, and the threads through steganography are there. And we're going to go deeper into them tonight to really open up this picture of what's actually happening, the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, the special report on a Saturday night. So great to be with all of you. We'll be taking your questions. Second half of the program. I got a lot to get through tonight before I jump into part two. Miss Olivia.
Wendy Eater, does DJ really think that Trump didn't anticipate a raid and was not prepared for it?
Well, I think there are contingency plans, but I think this is so bald-faced and, it's naked aggression, which is what the theme we started with. This is exactly what it is. That when you go after a presidency, presidents are protected institutionally. That is, someone who was president or somebody who wants to be president would never want to be connected with the idea of raiding a president or putting a president in jail. The first thing that Obama said when he got into office was, I'm not interested in going after Bush and Cheney, even though there's very good claims against these guys for war crimes, because it's time to move on and all that. What he's saying is, I don't want to become the target of that when I do my own shenanigans. And this is the interesting thing when we get around President Nixon and we look at that case, because Nixon comes up big time tonight. When we look at Nixon, we have to say that Nixon was actually doing what other presidents did. And Johnson did the exact same stuff. But Nixon was caught in a flux period, so that the things that he did, they knew these things had gone on all the time, but it was time to get rid of Nixon, who wouldn't go along with GATT and who had ended his Vietnam activity. He wasn't worth it for them anymore. And they wanted to move in a totally different direction. They also wanted to punish him for having a showdown with Richard Helms of the CIA over the Kennedy assassination. They became incredibly concerned about the exposure of the CIA's role in the Kennedy assassination, which Nixon was very well aware of. through the support of Howard Hughes. Now, the Kennedy aspect comes into this because when we trace this from the Tesla papers and John G. Trump's involvement, it's the FBI again. And I'm going to show you some really weird things about the FBI's role in relation to this, because if we jump for a moment to Tesla dying, we're going to early January 1943, and we're looking at the FBI instantly being on top of this situation. And they realize there are certain rules that have to be obeyed on this. And so what they do is they have something called the Alien Property Office that they call in. And they ask on the government side, who's our most trusted person that we can go in and have flesh out Tesla's files and give us the right, insights on it, but not tell the public about it. And so they go to Vannevar Bush. Now, Vannevar Bush says, well, my protege is hanging out. He works directly for the Rad Lab. This is your man. And that's John Trump. So when Trump goes to look at Tesla's work, he's somebody who's already under orders. Years later, John Trump will recount how the FBI agents were absolutely obsessed with documents that concerned the taking down of flying objects at a distance. They didn't say planes. They didn't say helicopters. Flying objects. The idea being, if I'm on the West Coast and I press a button and a flying object goes down over England, this is the technology that they were looking at. This is what they were looking for. And Tesla had been public about trying to give the United States a, quote, death ray to protect them from the Nazis, and also an invisible wall around the country so nobody could enter, who wasn't authorized. Very, very interesting things that Tesla was saying publicly just before his death. There's a lot of strange things around his death. There's certainly a lot of unusual numerology to where he was and his own obsession with 9 and the sequence of 3 that followed throughout his work. There's a lot of steganography throughout the case. And if we understand X-steganography in relation to this whole thing, including how the UFO file and the X file at the FBI got started, we're going to understand things a lot better, because it's much easier to understand how these things navigate through government agencies without being caught out. And, people will often say, well, too many people would have to be involved. So steganography solves a lot of those problems, because anyone can look at something, and if it's operating with steganography, they know it has a pass, for example. So if a project that is highly top secret comes out and has this X on it, then they know this can be moved through without the usual checks. It can be under a total slate of secrecy. Now, when we see what they did with Tesla's papers, we're going to observe a lot of this kind of secrecy. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to go deep here tonight in a special report on Tesla, John Trump, and the FBI raid at Mar-a-Lago. All these 3 things coming into play. Okay, moving directly now to the recovery of Tesla's papers by John Trump. Are you ready? There's a couple of key things here that are very important. So they're having conversations after the fact, and they have something here in the 80s that should raise some interesting eyebrows. Enclosed for the Bureau in New York is 1 copy each of pertinent pages from the 1981 book titled Tesla, Man Out of Time. This is a declassified FBI document. The book is by Margaret Cheney, and you're going to find interesting name loops in all this, like Governor Clinton, Margaret Cheney. But Margaret Cheney, who, as far as I can tell, doesn't have any relationship to Dick Cheney. But her book was kind of a breakthrough on Tesla in 1981, discussing the suppression of his inventions. And so here's the FBI nervously going back and forth about it, because the FBI, in fact, reported that originally in-house that there were 80 different boxes that were left behind at Tesla's residence. And what it turned out to be is that they surrendered up 9 years later, 60 of them, keeping 20 of the boxes. So they were under this suspicion, but it had been bubbling under for quite a bit. And interestingly enough, when we get a little deeper into this, we see that they actually never gave the boxes back and that the Tesla estate operating out of Serbia was requesting them. So when we go back and look at some of this, the FBI whitewash took many years to uncover itself, so that by the time we get to this period and we're talking about Tesla and understanding him as somebody who had created futuristic technologies and the idea of wireless energy, the way we have wireless internet now, most of that information was suppressed. As a matter of fact, my dad told me years ago that you wouldn't, in the 1950s, you wouldn't hear anything about Tesla, even though he was the man who invented alternating current. So I found that specifically very, very interesting. Okay, so here they ask that the book and the information that they've underlined be sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. Wright-Patterson, over and over again, the home of the UFO file, the home of the reverse engineered UFO file. You're going to find it coming up in these documents over and over again. Now, some weird crossovers with the seizing of Tesla's effects and the Mar-a-Lago raid. I just want to read a couple of these quick reports. Another FBI report, this one, January 9th, 1943. Experiments, Tesla deceased. Espionage. That's the opening of the door of how they get all of this stuff, just the same way that they used espionage in the National Archives thing to try to get the Trump documents. Standing scientist in electrical field died. 1943 at his hotel in New York. And they go deeply here, unfriendly to the war effort. And so they were keeping an eye on him, and they in fact had been tapping his phone, etc. A number of the things, articles in Tesla's hotel room after his death, note cabinets, and one of the inventor's safes. They will end up grabbing the safe and cracking it open. Sound familiar? That's part of what they recovered there from Tesla when they got him. Now, right off the bat, when they went through these things, one of the things that John Trump remembered years later is that they were obsessed, one, with the flying object aspect in his research, and two, that when he went to open the effects of Nikola Tesla, that the FBI agents ran and hid because they thought it was booby-trapped. So here's the actual now record, public statement that we get from John Trump at the time, after only 3 days of looking at 80 boxes of material. Okay. It should be no discredit to this distinguished engineer and scientist whose solid contributions to the electrical art were made at the beginning of the present century to report that his thoughts and efforts during the last 15 years were primarily speculative, philosophical, and somewhat promotional, often concerned with the production of wireless transmission of power, but it does include new sound workable principles. John G. Trump, Technical Aid, Division 14, that's the RAD lab. That's Trump after 3 days. This is his announcement to the world that, don't worry, everything that was hanging out there. Now, early on, as I said, if we go back to 1932, it's John Trump who gets adopted in the MIT system by Vannevar Bush. And in an interview just before he died, John Trump will recall how he met Bush. And I think there's a few lines here that are worth kind of getting into. So the interviewer asks him, so you went to MIT, your original intention was to go into electric power types of applications. And then Trump says, that's right. I'd become interested in the design of electric power machinery, and MIT had a good team of professors in the Department of Electrical Engineering. I came there primarily to become a good designer of high-powered electrical machinery. In the process of looking for a doctorate's thesis, I selected a suitable topic in my area and went to see Vannevar Bush, who later became director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. That's the office that they'll loan out to the FBI when Tesla dies. That's where Trump will be loaned out of. Bush heard me on my problem and then said, you ought to go and see Van de Graaff. He had just arrived at MIT from Princeton, and he said had some wild ideas. The interviewer, so Bush said he had checked out a few of them? Trump, Yes, Bush said that. The next morning, I went to the indicated room in the new physics building at MIT. I was expected to find an old Dutchman. I knocked on the door, and the room was empty. In the far corner, there was a young man, and it turned out that this is Van de Graaff. Now, interestingly enough, Van de Graaff is also going into very deep sort of X technology areas. So John Trump, for the next 5 years, is going to be heavily mentored by de Graaff and Vannevar Bush in these electromagnetic areas. And what's going to happen is that is a development of the X technology. When the UFO file comes in big time in the 40s, they're going to put these two worlds together because they cross over. All right. A couple of things about Tesla and the death ray that are going to open up the thing about his case. And we're going to understand how the importance of Trump going in there and getting this information. Tesla claimed that efforts had been made to steal the death ray invention that he had created, saying his room had been entered and his papers had been scrutinized, but the thieves or spies left empty-handed. This is from a New York Times article, 1937. He said there was no danger that his invention could be stolen, for he had at no time committed any part of it to paper. The blueprint for the Teleforce weapon was all in his mind. This is also interesting as a piece, because if we think about the FBI now is founded in 1935. One of their big targets by 1937 is Nikola Tesla. Again, the FBI being set up as a way to get access to deeper information relating to X technology before the UFO file aspect. So by the time we get into the 40s with the FBI involvement in creating, through Guy Bannister, the X files around the UFO aspect, this is it. They've been developing this advanced technology part through eavesdropping, which is wiretapping was what they had. They even had it at the time. In 1937, at his birthday press conference, Tesla was asked about his weapon and made the claim, "It's not an experiment. I've built it, demonstrated it, and used it. Only a little time will pass before I can give it to the world." At his 1940 birthday press conference, an 84-year-old Tesla offered to develop his weapon for the U.S., but supposedly there's no interest in the offer. There was an agreement dated in April 20th, 1935, between Tesla and Amtorg Trading Corporation, as highlighted from the released unclassified FBI archives. They put out about 250 pages 5 years ago. Contained within the extract, Tesla agreed to supply plans, specifications, and complete information on a method and apparatus for producing very small particles in a tube open to air, and for increasing the charge of the particles to full voltage of high potential terminal for projecting the particles at a distance of 100 miles or more. The maximum speed of the particles was specified as 350 miles per second. He received a $25,000 fee for this disclosure, and he had a deal with this Amtorg Corporation. So by the time 1940 rolls around, it's interesting because Tesla's been so heavily sidelined, because what he had developed by 1912 at Wycliffe and all these other places was the ability to transmit energy at a distance wirelessly. So he had demonstrated remote control, and he's actually not credited, but he invented radio, which they gave Marconi the actual patent to. And X-rays, he's also another one who was very ahead of the game on that before anyone. So most of what we see as the innovations from the 19th into the 20th century are really Tesla-led. By the time we get to 1912, he comes back to J.P. Morgan and says to these people, look, not only can you do wireless communications, which they would use as the foundation for all the wireless communications we had later, but he said, you can do wireless energy. And those people thought about it for a while. We have to get rid of this guy and shut him down, or give him a side job, anything. But, we can't have this getting out, because all the millions and trillions that we plan to make through the oil economy would just go away. So this guy has an idea. He's going to give us free energy in 1912. So what happens is the society, there's a lot of things about electrical development, including electric cars, electric streetcars. In San Francisco, they actually have them. But the society is turned down and turned back into a fossil fuel economy. And this is what they wanted to build. And so they reject the innovation and they sideline this heavy duty, inventor. But, I guess Tesla's more of an inventor. He sees a vision for humanity and how it can develop. He also sees the advantage that if energy is free, there won't be wars over it and things of this nature. So we move away from all that, and there's a kind of an unconscious thing when people get around the Tesla story. They understand subconsciously that humanity's robbed of this innovation of that time, and instead we get the whole push for Einstein and the atomic bomb and all the rest. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report. We're going deep here on what were some of those threads with Uncle John Trump and Nikola Tesla. Of course, one of the major episodes of the X series is Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule, where we laid out foundational information 4 years ago about this entire story. What I want to do is, with the whole information around the raid, I think we need to really go deep on understanding the nature, because in 2018, they hadn't really let out this whole thing about the UFO threat. And I think when we look at this and what's happening, we can really tie these things together. And part of it with the shutdown of society, the shutdown of free speech, and the control, the digital ID and these types of moves, we can really explode the whole game back to what that battle is all about between these groups. And the major piece sitting in the center at the heart of it is the UFO file and the X technology that sits in that UFO file. Not just from crashed spaceships, but relation to advanced inventions around energy and advanced scientific understanding. The UFO file relating directly to crashed UFOs and things like that, that all resides within the same thing. And one of the conclusions I came to a long time ago is the thing that the secrecy is meant to hide the most is a property called apotheum, which you could say is a word I invented. I've pointed it out that there are aspects that are like it in history, but it's APOTHEUM. And what we need to understand about that is they've tracked a kind of physics effect, which basically is an anti-physics. And so the universal understanding of the physical world, the way we comprehend it, goes away when apotheum is activated. And this is the thing that strikes fear in the heart of the groups that are in charge of this in the deep state, like X-Protect. And I could say that apotheum, all you have to do is study the UFO cases themselves. I remember a conversation that I had many, many years ago with someone who was working with John Mack. And one of the things that John Mack was doing was he was training these people who were being abducted to develop astral travel. So during astral travel, they could develop a kind of astral self-defense against this. Think about that. This is somebody who was a Harvard professor who knew a lot about UFOs and dealt with many, many cases. Why was he engaged on this level? Well, many of the cases that came to him, when the people were abducted, it was under unusual circumstances. For example, they would be abducted and then they would be walked through a wall. So all the physics went completely out the window. If you read about John Keel and the early 60s UFO researchers, there's all kinds of physical effects which don't add up in our world. They require an extra dimensional effect to take place. So this is what the apotheum aspect resides directly there in that UFO file. And this is a big key to understanding their own levels of fear in relation to it. All right, so let's take a look now at, let's kind of wrap up the Tesla, what they took and what they got back piece. And then we're going to go into Sarah Barker and Trump's uncle. It's going to open things up on a particular level. I'll remind you that you're watching the Dark Journalist special report. Please go to darkjournalist.com. Sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter and keeps us in touch regardless of anything else that may be happening. And it's crucial because the social media censorship is at such a level. And I think that these groups and some of the really crazy leftist moves that we see on the board, although I don't look at this as a right-left thing, but right now the left is showing the most insanity. I think they're getting ready to arrest Trump and make a big circus spectacle out of it. So I think that we need to kind of up our attention and our focus around this. And the raid itself is going to become that line in the sand where we say, you're not taking away the constitutional republic. And we're going to be able to do it through a judicious electoral process. And that's going to be, for sure, the greatest way to stand up to the kind of egregious, flouting of the Constitution and the violations that we see going on. And it's very interesting that it's Trump because of this background. And a lot of people might just think, like Trump is one sort of loud politician representing a certain group, of Republicans or whatever. It's a much different, much deeper situation. And our ability to perceive those things that are happening is going to help us navigate this particularly troubling period with real psychosis going on in the Biden regime and the World Economic Forum and the CCP. There's too many forces, there's too much power in tech hands, and we need to reverse that process and bring some of that power back to the people who have sense and a vision for the future that includes human freedom. So we're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program. How are we doing out there?
Great. Candace wants to know, Nikola Tesla had 3 patents about time travel as well. His experimentation was done at the New Yorker Hotel, a huge power bank in the basement. Does this become important?
Well, one of the things that he was able to pull off was an actual earthquake in Manhattan with that stuff that he had there in the basement. The time travel piece, I have a whole thing here also about him showing that we had some kind of contact with aliens through radio signals. So Tesla's an innovative thinker. I know through the work of Thomas Townsend Brown that we were working very deeply on time travel. It might not be exactly the way we think about it, landing in a different time and that kind of thing. It might be more about viewing different times. And so I would say we need more info in relation to the time travel aspects. There's some compelling pieces that when you get to a certain level of understanding, your relationship to time changes. I remember there's a famous quote involving P.D. Ouspensky, and they were talking to him, his students there as part of the fourth way teaching that he gave out, were talking to him and saying, how do we, they're in the middle of World War II, and they're saying, how do we, with all these things going on, ever hope to advance? And he said, well, as you advance personally, conditions change on the outside. So you can take that a few ways, which is actually from your own self-growth, the world that you're in is different. It's a level higher than the one you were just in. Suggesting that the things that we do personally, yes, they have an impact on the world, but also our position in the world changes as a result of our own efforts. So when we get to actual time travel, I do believe it exists, but I think we might need to kind of revision it. And I certainly think that Tesla would be somebody who understood that aspect, going into 1, alien contact, 2, wireless energy, 3, the idea of a protective, when they call it the death ray, where they were up against the Nazis at the time. So this is somebody who already had the laser and these things worked out. This is very kind of Atlantean technology. I believe the things that Tesla were working on, we can classify, that's the X technology. It's the same Keeley style technology coming out of that 19th century phase. And on some level, they don't know what to do with it. And I believe that the mystery schools with Keeley's technology, the Theosophical Society, and the reason Besant decides not to let that out is she's already thinking World War I is approaching. These people are going to annihilate each other with this. So there's a developmental curve, I think, when we look at this information. What else you got?
Karen Carpenter wants to know how much of the public Tesla story and popularity is dis or misinfo?
That's a good question. It's a discovery process. Remember, it's just like I was telling you in relation to my dad. He said when he was growing up, people didn't talk about it. So there's a discovery that, oh, there's this person back there that was sidelined. And so when we get around to this period of time, we're discovering more about Tesla and we're starting to understand, aha. Now, a lot of things get projected in there along the way, but I feel like things get suppressed. The UFO file, for example, in 1947, there was a major uptick with all the sightings, and we got Kenneth Arnold and all the rest of it. We just had the 75th anniversary. So those things could have been a cooperative exercise with the public and the government. Instead, it became the government, and then the government seeking ways to exploit what they had learned. And also, if we think about the way science works, one guy makes a discovery, and then another guy makes a discovery based on his discovery. If you cut off that version of things and you compartmentalize it over here, then the public never gets wind of that. That's why when I've done my own research around this, I've discovered there are two groups involved. The X-Protect group, who's exercising the deep secrecy and at times lethal secrecy, and the X-Share group. And this goes all the way, this is Thomas Townsend Brown, Caroline group, Hemingway, JFK, that whole sweep. These are people who want to move the culture forward. One of the major things that we discover when we look at the Watergate lawyer Doug Caddy's revelations about Kennedy is that E. Howard Hunt was saying, what? We need to eliminate Kennedy over the UFO file. Well, if Kennedy wanted to spread this kind of information, think about him having this knowledge. And this is somebody who's all about freedom. He understands the world is in a backward stage. And he wants to share that information with his counterparts. And Kennedy at the time puts out a memo on November 12th saying, I want the CIA, it's to the CIA director. And he says, I want to share the high threat cases of UFO contact and activity with the Russians. And so this is for them, a national security threat on the CIA side, because everything that they've been doing, that's their baby, and they don't want to share any of it. They want to develop it for their own purposes, because remember, the Central Intelligence Agency, it's an extra constitutional agency. It's not in the business of helping the public or anything like that. The CIA comes directly out of Wall Street law firms. And, there's that foundation of General Galen and the Nazi technology intelligence apparatus after World War II. Yes, but who is it for? So when we get into high finance and we get into S&C and all that, we find Dulles and all the people who set up the Central Intelligence Agency. They're all about advantage, whether it's drug running, whether it's advanced technology, whether it's overthrowing governments. It's about their advantages for their friends. And we can call that high finance. So the Lloyd Blankfeins of the world, the World Economic Forum. That's what they're masters of. That's what they've been great at for so long. And so I think that when we look at these things, we can see that there's a group in there that's been fighting through culture, through time. And that version is trying to get information about the UFO file out. It's trying to get advanced information out. It wants the kind of world to enjoy the bounty of the wealth that the world has. Instead, you have very small groups. And I want to tell you that the most intelligent people that I've talked to in relation to the world problem, what's really going on in the world, tell me over and over again, small groups controlling this, maybe 1,000 people. So we have to understand what we're up against. There's a gigantic apparatus, but the actual Wizard of Oz is maybe small. And I think that helps us open our eyes a little bit. Great questions so far. I'm looking forward to more as we go along.
Can I throw something else at you?
Sure.
So Nanette Christ is in the
Hey,
chat again.
Nanette.
She says, Reverend Moon bought the New Yorker hotel.
Oh, that is
we have
really
yet
fascinating.
to do an episode on Reverend Moon, and that would be great.
Yes. Moon has all kinds of deep connections with Bush. And there's that whole Asian American thing, because if you go from South Korea to America in that period of time, and then the whole development of Bush being the ambassador to China in that era, they were building up and setting the stage. And that's even before Nixon gets there. So, we're looking at very, very deep. They understood all about the East, all the things that we're going through when you have, China having 9% economic development and we have like 2.2 or something. That whole bit about us having inflation and Biden saying there's no such thing as inflation and all that, this whole weird situation that we're in, they foresaw this a long, long time ago. So if they're in the early 70s, late 60s looking at China, they already know what they can do with it. It's a massive labor engine, and it's one which can consolidate world power, which is really what they're all about. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report, going deep here with questions from the Ideas Room tonight, and I'm the one who's learning. I'm the student from the Ideas Room. This is interesting. Donald Trump's nuclear uncle, Amy Davidson Sorkin. Very interesting article all about Trump's uncle. And this is a Democrat writing in the New Yorker, trying to give us some kind of a contrast between Trump and his uncle. But watch what interesting things come out. In September 1936, a reporter for the Associated Press watched the unveiling of a new kind of X-ray machine said to be able to generate 1 million volts of power. The scientist operating the device was John Trump, professor of engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Trump was working the controls and explaining how high-speed electrons ran along a porcelain tube to a water-cooled gold target, when suddenly 2 high-voltage sparks hit him squarely on the nose, and yet according to the AP account, the direct strike caused him only slight discomfort. President Trump told the reporter, "That's an advantage of this machine. It's completely..." Professor Trump, told the reporter, "That's an advantage of this machine. It's completely grounded, and those sparks can't kill you." This is very advanced stuff at the time. If only the same could be said of the presidential campaign run by Trump's nephew, Donald J. Trump. And there, at the time, it's just before he comes into office, and they're like, he's so uncomfortably close to victory. And it's like, oh, if only he had the brains of his uncle. Here's the quote, though. He's still uncomfortably close to victory, which is why there have been lately more serious attempts to figure out what he might do if, say, he had access to nuclear weapons. Remember, they're rolling this out now that he supposedly has nuclear secrets at his house. In his answer, he seldom sounds as ungrounded as when he invokes Professor Trump, the younger brother of his father, Fred. Quote, "My uncle used to tell me about nuclear before nuclear was nuclear," Trump said. Before nuclear, perhaps referring to the development of hydrogen bombs rather than basic atomic bombs, or perhaps just to the netherworld where things wait until Trump judges them to be favorably flashy. He mentions his uncle so often and in such extravagant terms as brilliant, one of the top professors at MIT, that it seems worth asking that the professor and his arcane knowledge, what the professor and his arcane knowledge meant to him. This is very interesting because Trump is saying, and he's signaling early on, I have my uncle's info. And if he's saying I have nuclear, then he's suggesting advanced technology. So the steganography in those answers, because sure, John Trump dealt with nuclear subjects, but he could just as easily have said, my uncle knew about it, electrical engineering. He mentions nuclear, and nuclear, for people who understand what really took place in the Reagan-Gorbachev meetings, where they talked about going to a zero option and getting rid of all nuclear weapons, meaning that they had something else that was there. And this is very important for us to keep in mind, which is Reagan and Gorbachev negotiating in 1987 achieve some of the first real actual reductions, not just limitations, but real reductions in nuclear weapons, which was at the time not thought to be possible because Reagan was supposed to be a big hawk and Gorbachev, they didn't know very much about. And the two of them achieved a denuclearization to a degree that was just not thought possible. But in those discussions, they discuss the zero option, getting rid of all nuclear weapons. So we start to understand the language a little bit, that they're on that level, you're aware that we have something else, that there's another technology involved. And that's the way that they're able to have a discussion like that. Interestingly enough, as we know, Trump was also had that contact with Reagan. He was very deep with Nixon, but he also had a relationship of contact with Reagan. Reagan, interestingly enough, one of the things he wanted to discuss with Gorbachev was, if there's an alien invasion, will you help us? This is a very, very strange thing to bring in, or is it? Is this the kind of thing why they wanted that summit with just the two of them and a translator? And as I've pointed out before, the CIA, the State Department always tries to keep these presidents away from meeting up and exchanging views and talking in private, because they're afraid that this UFO file thing will get beyond what they're managing with it. So the Central Intelligence Agency feels we have a pretty good handle on this UFO thing. We don't want this top guy and that top guy from Russia getting together and talking about it. Because Russia, if they're not number one on the UFO file, they're certainly number two. And they have such an advanced program around UFOs that we need to keep that in mind too. Anyone who studies it goes back and looks at some of these figures who were in charge of Soviet Russia and realizes those guys were very deep on the UFO file. So these are the things to keep in mind. Okay, let's go deeper. I want to outline Sarbarker and his significance to this piece. So we just had that reference there to Trump and his uncle. They're close. Robert Sarbarker, as I've pointed out, largely pushed out of history because of his descriptions upon his retirement of the government working to redevelop UFOs. Sarbarker is somebody who also was the best friend of Thomas Townsend Brown. And what I found out through Thomas Townsend Brown's family is, every year for a month, they would take off to what they thought was San Antonio, Texas. Turned out that it was San Antonio, Cuba. And that one of the obsessions that Thomas Townsend Brown had with Sarbarker was this white sand. And of course, that piece of Cuba, very shortly thereafter, maybe about 20 years after the time that they were going down there all the time, is where Paulina Zalitsky is going to find that Cuban city underwater. And so there's something very, very deep when we get around Sarbarker and Brown. But if we think about Sarbarker in relation to Vannevar Bush, because he's the one who points him out as the person who's in charge of the UFO file, and how Bush is the mentor to John Trump, then we are starting to realize there's a UFO loop in all of this. Let's keep going. A remarkable interview occurred in Washington, D.C. on September 15th, 1950. The content did not leak out until the early 1980s when Canadian ufologist Arthur Bray found a memo by one of the participants, radio engineer Wilbert Smith of Canada's Department of Transport. Smith is very important because he's very deeply on the UFO file. And so he goes and he interviews his counterparts, and he goes and interviews physicists in the United States. In 1950, Sarbarker tells him, yes, we have a UFO program. And he says it's classified above the atomic weapons program. The memo described a conversation with physicist Robert Sarbarker, a consultant, U.S. Department of Defense Research Development Board. One of the regular meetings, Sarbarker and other government scientists asked with their Canadian counterparts about crash rumors. Sarbarker said they were substantially correct. He said UFOs exist. We have not been able to duplicate their performance. All we know is we didn't make them, and it's pretty certain they didn't originate on Earth. The issue is so sensitive that it's classified 2 points higher even than the H-bomb. In fact, it is the most highly classified subject in the U.S. government at the present time, unquote. That's Sarbarker on the record to Wilbert Smith. Smith died in the 60s, but mounted a small, short-lived UFO investigation project magnet for his government through official channels. Interestingly enough, I would find out later in studying Smith that he put out a book about telepathic communication with aliens. Now, this is really off topic, but it's quite fascinating that after being this very kind of technical radio guy and getting into it, that the next stage, the next level that he gets to is a kind of a telepathic communication.
Did he claim to have telepathic communication with aliens?
He did.
And was it an instruction book?
No, it's sort of an account of his discussions.
Well, that's damn interesting.
It is. And is very obscure. After the memos surfaced, ufologists found a listing for Sarbarker and Who's Who in America in the 1980s, 30 years later. I want to point out that this happens and we learn things in these arcs of time. Roswell, when it takes place in 1947, is not, except for the first 3 days, is not sussed out until 1977, when Stan Friedman finds the original people involved with finding the wreckage and all the rest. There's a 30-year lag where nobody hears anything about it. So there's a lot of stories along this line. And so there's kind of a gap. People talk about disinformation and things. Not disinformation that we're battling against. It's complete lack of information, the suppression of information that leaves a huge gap. I would say that's actually a bigger problem. Okay. So that's Smith. Now, what happens is there's a really radical, and that's Smith talking to Sarbarker. That's a shot of Sarbarker from the Saturday Evening Post. As I said, he was very well celebrated in the era, but now you can't even find a Wikipedia page on him because why? Because he blabbed about the UFO file. And he said a lot. There are UFO researchers, one of them was Wendell Stevens, who said if you follow the story of him speaking and giving all this information to a UFO researcher in the 80s named Bill Steinman, who wrote this remarkable book, which I often promote, called UFO Crash at Aztec. It's like a 500-page book, and it is amazing. I understand that Steinman passed away recently, but he was such a bold, he was not a trained researcher as such. He was just very bold. And he sent these letters just like, I want to get to the bottom of this. And Sarbarker really engages with him. I'm going to read some of the letters from this. So, so we went on record with the idea that in 1950, Smith talked to Sarbarker, and Sarbarker said, yeah, we have a UFO redevelopment program, 1. 2, it's headed up by Vannevar Bush, and 3, we have, it's basically it's a bigger secret than the atomic bomb. Okay, William Steinman, 1983. And he writes all these letters, and he's not getting a response. He's frustrated. And finally, he gets a letter back from Sarbarker. And Sarbarker lives around here in Cambridge and in Florida. Mr. Steinman, I'm sorry I've taken so long to answer your letters. However, I've moved my office and have had to make a number of extended trips. To answer your last question of your letter, October 14th, 1983, there's no particular reason I feel I shouldn't or couldn't answer any and all of your questions. I am delighted to answer all of them to the best of my ability. You listed some of your questions in your letter September 12th. I will attempt to answer them as you had listed them. 1, relating to my own experience regarding recovered flying saucers. I had no association with any of the people involved in the recovery. I have no knowledge regarding the dates of the recoveries. If I had, I would send it to you. 2, regarding the verifications that people you list were involved, I can say this. John von Neumann was definitely involved in the UFO program. Dr. Vannevar Bush was also definitely involved. And I think Dr. Robert Oppenheimer also. John von Neumann was definitely involved. My association with the Research and Development Board under Dr. Compton, remember Compton also headed up the UFO file, during the Eisenhower administration was rather limited, so that although I had been invited to participate in several discussions associated with recoveries, I could not personally attend the meetings. I'm sure they would have asked Dr. von Braun. And the others that you listed were probably asked, and they may or may not have attended. This is all I know for sure. I did receive some official reports when I was in my office at the Pentagon, but all of those were left there at the time. We were never supposed to take them out of the office. I do not recall receiving any photographs such as you request, so I'm not in a position to answer that. I have to make the same reply as I did on number 4. I recall the interview with Dr. Brenner of the Canadian Embassy. I think the answers I gave him were the ones you listed. Naturally, I was more familiar with the subject matter under discussion at the time. We were called dollar a year men. My first responsibility was the maintenance of my own business activity so that my participation was limited around the UFO redevelopment program. I am sure that our laboratories analyzed them very carefully. There were reports that instruments or people operating these machines, UFOs, were also of very light weight, sufficient to withstand the tremendous deceleration and acceleration associated with their machinery. I remember in talking with some of the people at the office that I got the impression that these aliens were constructed like certain insects we have observed on Earth, wherein because of the low mass, the inertial forces involved in operation of these instruments would be quite low. I still do not know why the high order of classification has been given, and while the denial of the existence of these devices, I'm sorry it's taken me so long to reply, but I suggest you get in touch with the others. Sincerely, yours, Dr. Robert Sarbarker. Okay. That's 1983. Sarbarker has affirmed that there was a UFO program. Again, it's 33 years later. And Sarbarker dies 2 years later. And some people try to say it's related directly to his revelations. I think the whitewashing of Sarbarker is very significant here as well. I don't know if they bumped off Sarbarker, but it is true that there's a story that a UFO researcher, Wendell Stevens, tells about Sarbarker going up to his car and finding a gooey substance on the door handle. And he gets in the car and drives away. He starts to feel woozy. He drives to the hospital. They check him in. He dies of a heart attack. So, but before he dies, he calls his son and says, there was this weird jelly stuff that was on my handle. So there's suspicion there that he was bumped off because he talked, and that's an ex-protect assassination. But whether or not it is, he put these things on the record. And then that whole story, you know, we hear about, oh, there's a 2017 thing about UFOs and the TTSA came out with all this. No. 1983, the actual physicist is telling you about the other physicists and the order of leadership of the UFO file program. So it's all there in black and white. Now, this is really interesting because, as I said, Sarbarker is somebody who's working deep in the UFO file, and he's pointing directly to Vannevar Bush as the person who's in charge. So Vannevar Bush, although he's identified in MJ-12 documents and other things, whether or not you take those seriously, Bush is outlined twice by Sarbarker, once in 1915, once in 1983 as the person in charge. But who is Vannevar Bush protege at MIT? It's John Trump. So this is how we understand when we get to the Tesla part of John Trump going and looking at the Tesla information. We're talking about somebody who's going to be very deep on this X technology level, and that's going to give us a real open window about Trump's knowledge going into the White House around the UFO file. And this is the crucial aspect. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report, going deep here with you on this. Great to have so many of you with us tonight, and just an outstanding crowd here tonight with us. We're going to be going into your questions here in about 15 minutes. I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible. I have a TKO for you, Miss Olivia. You ready?
Yes.
All right. So it's always bothered me how the order came down for Tesla's papers. And I did find how Vannevar Bush had suggested John G. Trump as the person to go and do this. So that's on the record. But I always wondered about why they did it through the Alien Property Office, meaning somebody who was not a United States citizen when Tesla was. And then also some odd stories about the FBI instigating the whole thing, but wanting it under the shield of another program. So the TKO on this involves the person who was in charge on the FBI side, who was the assistant director of the New York district of the FBI, and that's Percy Foxworth. Now, here's the thing. Percy Foxworth orders John Trump to go with the FBI agents and to go through these 80 boxes. And as I said, won't return 20 of those boxes although they send back 60 of the boxes to Tesla's family some 9 years later. They never gave the other 20 back. Percy Foxworth, interesting thing happened along the way during the Tesla raid, which was when they went to raid the files of Tesla after his death. Percy is going to die within 4 days of ordering that. So he sends John Trump over there, and then he gets a call from Eisenhower who says, we need you in South America, and we need you to go over to Africa, and we need to suss this person out who's doing this whole double identity thing, and we need you to go undercover, this assistant director from the FBI. Now, the mission that Ike sent him on may be 100% legit, but what happened, it set up the opportunity for somebody to get our friend out of the way, because Percy Foxworth will die in what was the biggest aviation accident of the period directly after this, sending John Trump in to get the Tesla files. So from the FBI site, Percy Foxworth served as the chief of the FBI Special Intelligence Services, SIS, principal liaison with British security consultants. So beloved was he by the British that he had traveled through Latin America. In September and December 1940, M16 stations were ordered to fully cooperate with him along the way. On January 15th, 1943, Foxworth and Special Agent Harold Dennis Haberford were killed in a military airplane accident near Paramaribo, en route to North Africa at the request of General Dwight Eisenhower. The cause of the crash in the airplane was never ascertained. It's very suspicious. So quickly after sending Trump in to analyze Trump's papers, Tesla's papers, and then 3 days after the papers are, gone through, Trump comes out with a statement and says, oh no, there's nothing in there that would have been, of interest to foreign powers or whatever. And then the next day, this guy dies. And that's the end of apparently a very brilliant FBI career directly after he orders that. So whatever was going on with Percy's knowledge around the Tesla papers, it seems such a wild coincidence that he dies just a few days later. Come on. Knowing the impact that we're talking, the level of the X technology that was in Tesla's possession, one way or another, however you view that technology that they were looking for and what they found, the circumstances around it, that the man ordering it gets bumped off, is certainly a puzzling and very disturbing aspect of this. Percy Foxworth dies under mysterious circumstances.
It's very strange that they didn't come up with a cover story.
True. That's true. When you look at it, 33 people die in the crash. And so at the time, it is in fact the biggest aviation disaster for America. And the fact that he's, en route to this mission to go undercover in another country, and it's real easy circumstances to set him up in South America, unfortunately. So how do we make our way out of that one? Before we leave the Tesla aspect, I want to talk about this wall of force that he was talking about. And Tesla, we know, was very advanced, and also he got so many times, he was taken advantage of, and he ended up largely in poverty for most of his life. But his incredible innovation, certainly in the beginning, people like J.P. Morgan and others, and Edison, who stole a number of his inventions, looked at him and said, this is somebody that we can use. But soon as they got the idea that he's more of an ex-share person who wants to move the culture forward, and, he's going to destroy their chances at making money, then he's persona non grata. And like Sarbarker, he's brushed under the historical wing. So just a quick thing about him receiving radio signals that he thinks are alien, and then this military wall he wants to put as a defensive shield during World War II around America. Tesla's only military invention was a method to which he once alluded to but never fully described. This invention was a means whereby an impenetrable wall of force can be erected around the United States borders, which would render helpless any military attack. Tesla disclosed the existence of this plan in 1934 and stated he intended to present it to the Geneva Conference, but seldom referred to it afterwards. That's from Business Insider. Not much is publicly known about Tesla's impenetrable wall research beyond this. The only other details are presumably the ones he shared with New York Times writer William Lawrence in September of 1940. There's a reference during an interview there. So there may have been a series of black projects that he's associated with and that we never hear anything about, a la Thomas Townsend Brown as well. So we have to keep that in mind. But the fact that they're bugging Tesla and the FBI is working overtime to try to figure out what he's up to, and then when he dies, they swoop in trying to get his inventions. They're definitely aware that there's something extracurricular going on in his research. Okay, Discoverer. This is from, I actually have the cover of the magazine. It's from 1903. It's Nikola Tesla promises communication with Mars. That's the actual newspaper. The Discoverer believes one of the planets may have already perfected a scheme of interplanetary communication. Tesla's almost incredible discovery was made by him in Colorado 2 years ago while he was conducting experiments in relation to wireless transmission of energy. He worked in a laboratory specially constructed. Quote, this is Tesla now. As I've already said, one of the planets in the solar system may be ahead of us in the evolution. Their means of interplanetary communication may be perfect, but we have yet to learn their sign language. It's impossible at present even to suggest a code, and my observations to the Red Cross Society on New Year's Eve were speculative, but for purposes of illustration, they will answer the purpose of the present. It is enough to say at this time that a message from Mars, which might be a triangle to them, would appear as some other form to us and vice versa. Their differences can only be reconciled by time and careful study. It's wonderful enough, is it not, that a beginning has been made. So what happened was he's in his laboratory and he's sending out radio signals and he gets them back and it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And it's clearly a communication back and forth. He just doesn't know who's on the other end of that. There have been suggestions that, in relation to the Black Knight satellite, that the thing that Tesla observed in 1899 was the Black Knight satellite, which resurfaces again in the 1940s with people observing something large scale that looks like a satellite before we had them out there. I want to suggest that this could be a technology from the outside. It could be off-world civilizations visiting and things of this nature. Or there could be an advanced group here that was far beyond, Sputnik and things like that, and just kept their presence very stealthy. And, a lot of times we get this with the Nazi technology and people looking into that. And Dr. Farrell has gone very deep in saying what they did have and what they didn't. But I think it's possible that we can look in history and see something riding side by side with us that appears to be more advanced. I go back to this Casey quote when talking about Ezekiel and Ezekiel's wheel. And he gets this question, when he's speaking about Atlanteans. And they're like, well, you're talking about Atlanteans flying around and flying machines. What kind of machines were they? People in the 1930s wanted to know. And he said, very much like what Ezekiel described, but at a much later date. This is very odd because the Atlantean technology, you would assume, went down with Atlantis. But here he is suggesting somebody had that Atlantean technology. And when it shows up to Ezekiel, he thinks, this is God coming down to talk to me. But it's actually an advanced Atlantean ship. So who's keeping that technology at this much later date? This is kind of an interesting, fascinating loop off the Casey rating. So we have to keep our minds geared up to that. everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Great to have you all here. I want to remind you to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter to keep us in touch if you haven't already. And that's really kind of the best way during this incredible social media shutdown action that we see. And I expect a lot more censorship coming into the fall and the elections and the big squeeze from all sides and the deep state overdrive. That's a free newsletter to let you know what incredible shows and interviews that we have coming up for you. Some very special interviews coming up, and also some remarkable events that we have coming up this fall and documentaries. You don't want to miss it. Trust me. Okay. Miss Olivia, you hanging in there?
Yes. Would you like to field a question?
Sure.
Stefan Vanderlaan wants to know, do we know how Tesla died?
Yeah, I think it's officially heart failure. Actually, it's interesting. I can read a little piece of that, and this is one of those, just to give you that aspect of floating around. We have John Trump in the middle there with Tesla and President Trump. Interesting indeed. Okay, one of the more controversial topics involving Nikola Tesla is just what became of his technical and scientific papers. The morning of the inventor's death, his nephew, Sava Kasanovic, hurried to his uncle's room at the Hotel New Yorker. He was an up-and-coming Yugoslav official and suspected connections to the Communist Party in his country. By the time he arrived, Tesla's body had already been removed. That's interesting. Kasanovic suspected that someone had already gone through his uncle's effects. Technical papers were missing, as well as the black notebook he knew Tesla kept. A notebook with several hundred pages, some of which were marked government. P.E. Foxworth, assistant director of the New York FBI office, we know what happened to him, was called in to investigate. According to Foxworth, the government was vitally interested in preserving Tesla's papers. 2 days after Tesla's death, representatives of the Office of Alien Property went to his room at the New Yorker and seized all his possessions. Dr. John Trump, electrical engineer of the National Defense Research Committee of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, was called in to analyze the Tesla papers in OAP custody. Following a 3-day investigation, Trump concluded, and he came out with that statement. Of course, 3 days for 80 boxes, as we realized, doesn't add up. And this is from the Cheney book on Trump. On Tesla. Just after World War II, there was a renewed interest in beam weapons. Copies of Tesla's papers on particle beam weaponry were sent to Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. An operation codenamed Project Nick was heavily funded and placed under the command of Brigadier General Craigie to test the feasibility of Tesla's concept. In 1952, Tesla's remaining papers and possessions were released to Sava Kasanovic. In return to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, there was a museum that was created in the inventor's honor. For many years under Tito's communist regime, it was extremely difficult for Western journalists and scholars to gain access to Tesla's archive in Yugoslavia, even when they were allowed to see selected papers. This was not the case for Soviet scientists. And Soviet Premier Khrushchev was interested in Tesla's papers. Now, work on beam weapons continued in the United States. So we had DARPA. The Soviets were using the Tesla technology. Interestingly enough, for many years, scientists and researchers have sought Tesla's missing papers with no apparent success. It's inconceivable that if Nikola Tesla knew a means for accurately projecting lethal beams of energy through the atmosphere, he would have taken it to the grave with him. So there's a missing technological aspect here. There's missing records. There's missing boxes. And already his nephew suspects when he gets there something is up. When you look at the people who show up at the death of Tesla, it's very unusual because over and over again, aside from John Trump, you see Wright-Patterson people. Wright-Patterson becomes the heart of secret UFO research technology. And so we're looking at a whole kind of collection of deep secrecy. And what they're looking at the time is this Tesla X technology. And eventually, places like Wright-Patterson will become the loop for the UFO X technology. The first major crash that we're aware of, although from what I understand, there are several major crashes before this, but 1941 in Cape Girardeau. And so by the time we get to the 47 wave, they already have some experience with what's going on here. So when we look at the UFO file, the control of the UFO file, and when these crashes occur, people like Bush, people like John Trump are already well seasoned dealing with the secrecy around the Manhattan Project. The MIT Mason Lodge was known as one of the most secretive of all. So that leaves a big gap in our understanding of what happened to the Tesla information, just like we have a huge gap of what happened with the UFO file. It went deep into these hands, CIA hands, the hands of the military industrial complex, the aeronautic and the aerospace divisions. And then what we hear is alien stories or abduction stories now start to get mixed in with the psyops that are going on with the government. So we get a very weird mix of things there. But we start to understand that the UFO file becomes the major secret in the national security state. And this involves the Central Intelligence Agency. This involved NSA. And this involved military intelligence. DIA, let's not forget them. JFK created DIA as kind of a competitor to get intelligence back to the military and not have this weird CIA with their own Air Force causing wars all over the planet, or preventing us from seeing things like that, which is this major case in Scotland that just came out. And this is 1990. This picture was taken, was suppressed for 30 years. How it got out, it's really interesting. It's a weird story about how it got out. But there it is, and that's a regular fighter jet in the background, and up front is one of these craft. So, you know, however you think of it, that's very advanced stuff. And in this case, it's hovering. All right. Now, how does this get us on the Trump-Tesla connection to the Trump-Nixon connection? This becomes the story, and the time capsule becomes a major piece of understanding that. And the raid and the information that they were seeking in the raid rings a bell. It rings a bell from this Nixon era as well. Not to mention the fact that Trump in his responses cited President Nixon. Also, you got to watch for steganography when you get around. This, I found some interesting steganography, X-steganography at Mar-a-Lago that we're going to talk about. Okay, one thing I want to point out. So in 2018, we took the information that we had from Merritt and others, and we put on the record that Trump and Nixon had a very deep relationship. And at the time, it was only known that there was one letter between them. We sussed it out, and when we came out with Robert Merritt's story, there was instant pushback from it. Snopes came out and instantly said, you know, did President Nixon hide proof of alien life in a time capsule? This is interesting for a lot of reasons. Nixon knew a lot being part of the real Blue Book, CIA Blue Book in the 50s. And if you look into that history, you'll find Nixon there. There are all the stories about him showing his friends like Jackie Gleason alien bodies. But in any case, as vice president for 8 years and president for 6, he'd be in a position to know a great deal about it. Now, the story from the Watergate whistleblower, Robert Merritt. Merritt was known as someone who had been used as an informant by various types of intelligence agencies. And there were stories floating around about him. This is one, Watergate's gay informant, because Merritt, of course, was gay and was used for his good looks to get blackmail on different people. There were a series of articles about him being used during Watergate and after. And he floated around in this kind of netherworld of doing these undercover intelligence jobs. They had identified him as somebody who was very smart and very manipulative, and actually certain psychopathic qualities to him as well. When I talked to him, I found him very honest, refreshingly honest about the things that he had done on behalf of the government. And some of them were incredibly dark. But I would say that a couple of things about Merritt. One is that I don't think that he was particularly interested in UFOs because aside from what Nixon gave him to deliver around the UFO file to other officials, he didn't seem like he wanted to talk about it. But he remembered the mission very well, and he worked as something as part of the Houston plan that Nixon had set up as a kind of internal CIA directly out of the White House, and which got shut down. And as part of Watergate, the record of it got expunged so that even groups like the Church Committee in the 1970s looking to figure out what on earth was the Houston plan up to, they weren't able to, and those records were shut out. And the records pertaining to the Houston plan as part of the Watergate investigations were shut down too by Judge Sirica. So it's really just gone. The only thing we have are these echoes of it. At the end of his life, and I had spoken to some officials from the NYPD about things that Merritt had done as an undercover asset for them, and that were on the record. And then there was a major article in the New York Times about Merritt and his work as an informer, something called the takeover of the Kenmore Hotel. Merritt was not somebody who was just a fly-by-night story person. He was somebody who was well-known and tracked since his Watergate days from his association with Carl Schaffler, who was the person who busted the Watergate burglars. So now we have Merritt coming forward and saying to me in our interviews, Nixon took me deep beneath the White House 3 times, and he asked me to do various things, but I was basically used as a courier for information. During one of those occasions, the 3rd time, Nixon mentioned to him that they had a source, an energy source from UFOs that they were redeveloping. And he mentions an energy formula to him, and he shares with him some things about the UFO file. And then he straps on this message to Merritt and sends him on his way to give a copy of this message to Henry Kissinger. It's during the beginning of the Watergate period, and Nixon basically tells him, I'm going to keep this message that you're delivering, I'm going to keep a copy of it in the White House. So basically, future generations are going to know about this. Nixon was known to have all kinds of different sides, but it is true that at certain times he was very spontaneous. And as when he went out during all these big protests in the middle of the night, Vietnam protests, and went out to the Abe Lincoln Memorial and talked to the hippies and all this kind of stuff. He had a way of relating to people. And by his 3rd meeting with Merritt, he had come to trust him enough to tell him about this. So what was happening was Merritt was facing the end of his life, and he wanted that time capsule that Nixon had placed there to come out. And he was using me as kind of a conduit to get that message out. And he had Doug Caddy, the Watergate lawyer, as someone else who he trusted with this information, and he wanted to have Caddy legally represent him with the National Archivist. Now, I want to point out David Ferrero is the archivist that gave Trump a problem in the beginning, saying, hey, you've taken these classified documents and all this kind of stuff. This is the same person that in February of 2018, Caddy contacted legally on behalf of Merritt and said, here are the terms. And I just want to mention what he put in there. He basically, that's the original letter. But what the letter basically says is, I'm willing to give you the location of this message to the American people that Nixon kept as a time capsule in the White House relating to the UFO file. All that I want is that the press has to be there while it's read and in the open. You're the National Archivist. You work this out. So in part of this letter, as Merritt told me, it's in the letter, Also, President Nixon disclosed to Mr. Merritt that he had a message to the American people that he had hidden at a location in the White House for accidental discovery for someone in the future. He disclosed the location to Mr. Merritt with the stipulation that Mr. Merritt could reveal it at some future time if he deemed circumstances merited it. Okay. So Merritt saying through his lawyer to the archivist, Ferrero, set up the circumstances and I'll reveal the time capsule where it is. Now, Ferrero, in February of 2022, writes this letter to President Trump. And it says, this is the White House. I'm sorry, this is Trump writing back to Ferrero. It says, I am writing in response to your communication of January 18th, 2022, informing us that former President Trump has made claims of executive privilege with regard to a subset of documents requested by the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack. So they were already in relation to J6 on the using this National Archive angle. They were saying, oh, well, because we're going to have a House Select Committee, we want all these documents. They were already working that angle before they got around to, hey, Trump is keeping nuclear documents. So they want something that's in Trump's possession. This is what I think becomes very obvious to us. At the time now, just going back, this is the episode that I did with the interviews that are there, a couple of different interviews with Merritt. And this came out in February of 2018. Now, Merritt claimed to me later that there was a rush between the Central Intelligence Agency and the Trump White House to find this thing. And he mentioned a lot of things to me. One is that his place got broken into, and that basically the whole thing had become a hassle for him. And so I sympathized a lot with that. I remember when I was putting the video out that within 7 minutes of it going up, PBS had made a copyright claim to it because the first initial version had something about a guy waving a pennant in 1960 during the JFK nomination. And I had used a clip, this probably 3-second clip, and they dinged it with a copyright thing immediately. And YouTube took the video down. I had to reload the video without this little thing in it. Now, of course, you expect things in terms of copyrights and all the rest, but this was highly insignificant. So that I can tell you from what happened in relation to Merritt that whatever was going on with this time capsule story, in my own work, I would say myself, Doug Caddy, and Merritt all experienced a certain level of difficulties around it that were, that gave you the impression somebody was more than a little interested in the whole thing. And, you expect that when you do certain types of journalism, but once in a while that needle jumps and you become aware somebody is really looking for information about this thing. Now, the message and the whole story that's there hung out after the fact. I did my best to bring that story forward. I interviewed Merritt. I talked to him the first time for 6 hours up and down, trying to shake him out of his story, and nothing would work. He was very consistent about it. And he also told me about things like assassinations that he had been involved with working for the CIA. So when we look at Merritt and his story, what is he trying to tell us? Here are the real bullet points. One, that he worked as an undercover agent for President Nixon and that he had 3 meetings beneath the White House. 2, that as part of that, he became a courier of very sensitive documents. And that by the 3rd meeting, Nixon had given him some insight as to what those documents were. And they related to the UFO file and advanced technology and the fact that they had developed an energy formula as a result of working with those things. And he had told him, I'm going to leave a time capsule in the White House. This will be discovered eventually. So what I want to say about Merritt, as opposed to some claims that just come out about this, is that Merritt had been used as a informant in major cases involving the UN. Of course, around Watergate with Karl Schaffler, his name was known and he was brought before grand jury committees and things of this nature, and then they wouldn't allow him to testify. He was also used in these very early editions of secret FISA courts to, go in late at night and give testimony to these judges to get subpoenas for things that were relating to political infighting. So I've never saw any reason in my dealings with Merritt for him to make up a story like this. So we have something there. When we think of that tight relationship with Trump and Nixon now, we have to go a little bit further and say, well, if Nixon had this information about the UFO file, did he consider Trump a like mind with it because of Trump's uncle? And did he also share more of those details with him? So when Trump comes on the scene, the entire establishment flips out and they lose it, and they try for 4 years, the whole time he's in there, barring his obnoxious personality, and the typical shooting matches between Republicans and Democrats. Something extra was going on here. And it seemed all the way through with the subpoenas, with the different, Russian collusion, all these different types of things, the constant brainwashing by the media that he's a Russian agent. And even now, doing a raid on Trump and saying, oh, it's espionage, that's a heavy duty charge. You better have real damn good evidence if you're going to throw around those things. And all the legal experts coming forward say, no, the way that they're approaching this isn't showing that they have good evidence up front. And you wouldn't do it this way. You'd do it through a series of subpoenas. So something weird is going on here. And my personal research around it reflects directly and goes to the heart of the UFO file. This is where we need to take the conversation, because as you see all around you, almost on a daily basis, there's some kind of UFO disclosure this, UFO disclosure that. Well, are there messages? Is there steganography that's out there that could be giving us this message? I'm going to point to a couple of things. And then after that, we're going to go directly to your questions. I know I'm holding you up, Miss Olivia, but I'm doing my best. How are you doing out there?
Yeah, we have more than enough questions.
All right, good. A couple of quick things. All right, we talked about the big involvement with the Cheneys, who are fellow Republicans, supposedly, doing everything they can to get to Trump, right? Liz Cheney was basically doing it all. Dick Cheney came out with a commercial, good old trustworthy Dick Cheney, and said, well, Trump is the biggest threat to the Republic. I mean, come on, don't you think we have bigger threats to the Republic? Even if he is, your political enemy or whatever. Okay. This story just came out today. Liz Cheney's husband is a partner at the law firm defending Hunter Biden. What's going on there? Liz Cheney with the Bidens. All right, let's start to add this up. Mathematical equation. Next up, Hunter Biden met with dad. This just came out today. Hunter Biden met with dad immediately after Romanian business meetings. So in the middle of all this, was the Hunter Biden story about to explode? Was it about to go down and be exposed that these high-level Republicans were shielding Biden, in fact, and that those dealings that were going on were highly illegal, and that he was using the influence of his father on it? And is that why they decided we need something that grabs all the attention, and we need to just, bring this home with Trump and have this whole, now we're all questioning, oh, what does he have? Instead of asking what's going on with Hunter Biden and the incredible exploiting of the White House for business purposes. And why is Liz Cheney's husband working at a firm that's defending Biden? Very, very strange. Okay, now it's just about to get a little stranger. Let's not forget our friend in the hot zone, the Terramar champion, Ghislaine Maxwell herself. But Ghislaine, in relation to Trump, how are we going to, what's the relationship there? Well, I don't think there is one, but I think something very significant happened. Watch this. So we have the Trump receipt for property, United States Department of Justice. They give us the receipt of all the different things that they took from President Trump. All right. Let's go back to November, where Ghislaine is making very strange stream of consciousness comments out of nowhere about her time in prison and sounding very, very stream of consciousness. And also some strange, just random observations and complaints and things like that mixed in there. Watch the steganography here. The salads are wilted with mold. An apple had worms. They gave me a wet black banana. There was bread so wet that water came out when you squeezed it. The heiress explained that she had created an imaginary cellmate after being trapped in solitary confinement since she was incarcerated, and has a light on in her cell every 15 minutes to ensure that she hasn't injured herself. Maxwell continues, strange things happen. The toilet flushes, the shower runs when no one is around. When it happens, it alarms the guards, so I created a cellmate. Called it A-17, A-17. So when something strange happens, I blame A-17. She also claimed that creepy guards watch her as she uses the toilet and shower. Maxwell said that despite observation problems, she managed to find a friend in the bathroom, a friendly rat, who she said jumped down an open sewer drain. They gave me food so exaggerated that it looked like Chernobyl. Interestingly enough, this is before the Ukraine war started, and right at the very beginning of the Ukraine war, there was a huge kerfuffle there militarily at Chernobyl, and instant denials, and that everything at Chernobyl was classified. We know Chernobyl was the site of an incredible meltdown. But that's not the real zinger. The real zinger is if you go through that list that is part of the receipt for property for Trump, you find, bingo, right in the middle of those folders, something called number 12, box labeled A-17. Now, A-17, the same terms that she's using earlier in relation. And very oddly, she has no explanation for why she's referring to it as A-17. Is there signaling here that whatever they're looking for, you're going to find it in A-17? Could very well be. But that list becomes a hell of a lot more interesting if we consider it in combination with Ghislaine's statements in November. There's no question about it. And how does this leave us? Well, we find ourselves with the raid on Trump, as Trump's doing very well in the polls and is the Republican opposition to President Trump, to President Biden, and Biden is using the Federal Bureau of Investigation to investigate Trump, which has never been done in history against a political opponent. So we're in a constitutional crisis territory with that. Trump and Nixon. We told you in 2018, I don't like to say I told you so, but we told you about that deeper relationship. It's come out through the Nixon Foundation that there's some 400 letters between the two. A deep relationship that went on for decades. As a matter of fact, Nixon may have given Trump the key advice that allowed him to become president. And they may have had the UFO file in common, as it turns out. There's a piece here that is the Mar-a-Lago Club POTUS helicopter landing pad. And along with some interesting steganography there, this HMX-1 I found very interesting, which was the symbol that was used there. And I did a lot of checking on that HMX-1 to see what the history was involved. That's it from its development in 1957, kind of a helicopter Air Force One using that X steganography. And when I went deeper into it, I found some odd things about it. One of the things that I discovered about the aircraft was that the X aspect supposedly related to its experimental properties. And then later they say, since it doesn't have, well, I'll just read it. The X in the squadron designator originally stood for experimental, emblematic of its original mission of testing new helicopters and flight systems. However, As its operational role in VIP transportation overshadowed its operational test and evaluation role, the experimental moniker was dropped, although the squadron designator X was left unchanged. It's odd. They wanted the X steganography noted in there for some reason, and then it shows up on Trump's Mar-a-Lago invitations. I don't think there's a good answer for that one. And here's another real important. Oh, that's kind of a better shot of that, I guess. That's the original coin from it, 1957. But this brings us around to Roger Stone, because interestingly enough, if you look in the warrant at the things that were taken, one of the things that were taken were relating directly to the president of France. But the other thing that they had a huge curiosity about was what? The pardon information around Roger Stone. Well, Roger Stone, aside from being, kind of a political hitman and things like that, he's been on this program before, especially when they were pressuring him and trying to put him in prison. And we've talked to him before about the JFK assassination, which he did a book on. And this is the tie over that I see in relation to Stone. It's this Nixon JFK aspect hanging out there in the background. Somehow they wanted that information about him pardoning Stone. And I see the overlap directly of the JFK files, the assassination files, which, as we discussed earlier this week, Judge Napolitano had asked President Trump to release, and Trump was going to do it, and then got him on the phone. And Napolitano said, "What happened? Why didn't you do it?" This is on October 26, 2017. Trump said, "If you saw what was in there, you couldn't release them either." I believe those things convince me that all of it is related directly to the UFO file. That would explain why they can't let those Kennedy records out, because the assassination is related, as we found out through E. Howard Hunt, directly to the UFO file. And in fact, what we're looking at is Trump in office, and the freak out of the establishment is also directly related to understanding and being on the same level as these people in relation to the secret system of finance and also the advanced exotic technology. It's the only thing that makes any sense, and they are willing to tear the country apart and shred the Constitution in order to do it. Now, you might be a fan of Trump, you might not be a fan of Trump, it doesn't matter. What we're talking about are forces fighting over something fundamental in public and attempting to throw all of the constitutional norms out the window in order to accomplish their aims of secrecy, and then bringing on a big CIA phony UFO threat disclosure. That stuff we have to be very awake to as it comes in, and that's what our goal is going to be on this. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Where to even start? Okay. The three free. Does the Trump-Nixon connection confirm they were all part of the same fraud, charade, great distraction, i.e. U.S. government politics et al., so we won't find our true powers?
Well, here's the problem with the political system, as Kennedy discovered. When you get up there, you have the greatest of intentions, but you're surrounded by what we call the swamp, and you have to find a way to arouse the public to give you a better platform to fight for them by exposing these things. Some of them are pretty ugly. Assassination's pretty ugly. Drug running's pretty ugly. Human trafficking's pretty ugly. So you have to find a way to be real with the public and also get them on a tip where, can all do something constructive together without them completely losing all the faith in the government that they have. So whoever you get up there, whether it's Nixon or, Obama or Bush or Trump, whatever it is, they're all going to have, they're all going to have faults, and they're all going to need to, at a certain level, give fealty to the system. And those who break out of that, who try to bring the public along with them, I think, face incredible odds, but they do it anyway. I think this is something that Kennedy showed. Kennedy came in a way very much how Trump came in. He had a better political sense, but he was independent. If you look at the kind of money that the Kennedys had going in there, it's like the Bill Gates, I mean, they had that kind of wealth for their era. And so they didn't owe anybody, if that makes any sense. Once you get in there financially, if you're a Richard Nixon, you owe Howard Hughes, you owe the businessmen who put you in there in the first place, you owe this corporation, that corporation. And so you get sort of instantly hung up. Trump comes in the same way. He's already a billionaire. He already has his base, and he has an incredible reaction with people who are sick of the system as it is and decide, you know what, we're going to throw a monkey wrench in there, and we're going to really get America back to what it was. Now, however you want to view the Trump presidency, think of it this way. Fundamentally, there weren't any new wars. Second, the economy did really well. And third, he would take on taboo subjects such as the border, which right now is hemorrhaging with 3 million people since Biden got into office. So because he wasn't politically correct, he was able to accomplish certain things, stand up to China, things like that. So, but politics always has their thing. Someone's going to say, this is great, that's not great, and so on. So Nixon, is useful to the deep state for a certain period of time, but then starts to go his own way, and they pull Watergate on him. Kennedy, when he gets in there, the CIA, that whole apparatus is worried about him. Once he gets around the UFO file, and he has a deep knowledge of the UFO file through his relationship with James Forrestal, the first defense secretary who was pushed out a window. They realize they have a problem with Kennedy, and they try just to kind of roll along with him. I think they think of different ways of removing him. But by the time they get to November of 1963, they're looking at Kennedy and saying, we're not going to get the Vietnam War out of this. He already cost us a Cuban war. He's not, good for the military industrial complex. He is not good for the Federal Reserve, and he is trying to share the information around the UFO file. This guy's the biggest threat we've ever had. So that whole apparatus, the Rockefellers and all the rest, Allen Dulles becomes a coordinator and all that. The Central Intelligence Agency, which Dulles has been fired from, becomes a coordinator. But that whole apparatus turns against Kennedy, and later turns against Robert Kennedy as well, because he's somebody who's kind of going to conjure up the ghost of Camelot and bring these things around. So the 60s, I always say a proper history of the 60s, we don't look at it correctly. All the PBS specials and all that nonsense, and you have a bunch of liberals who come on and say, like, we did this and we did that. It's actually a civil war, and our side loses. That's the way to look at it. And I think there's a tremendous lust for freedom in the 60s. But unfortunately, with the assassinations of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, all the leaders are dead. And the response from the establishment is phony investigations. Oh, a lone nut who just happened to get a job on the route where the president was going to drive by, but nobody knew that. And it was only 6 weeks before. And by the way, the lone nut worked for Guy Bannister, who was the FBI guy who started the UFO file. And actually, Oswald said he was going to work for NASA. So, we have to get a grip on history. We have to take a look at it and say, you know what? On the UFO file front, we're big enough now. Tell us the truth, but not the CIA truth. Give us the real aspect. Give us the JFK files. These stealth archives, we know that they're out there. We know that the government has information about UFOs. It has the JFK files revealing a lot, apparently. And so we're at a point, we're a schizophrenic point where they just play along, and they're like, and this is the next thing for you to be afraid of. And this is the next thing. We'll take care of you, and you can't ever see the cards that they have. At this point with the government, I'm glad they did this National Archives thing. I'll tell you what, let's play a game with the National Archives. Let's demand the National Archives give us the records, go to the CIA and say, give us the John F. Kennedy records. How about that? Let's start there. So if they're going to play a game and say, well, we're going to go after Trump because of the National Archives, well, good. We're going to go after the CIA for the National Archives and the JFK files. And, it's going to have to be a situation. It's going to be ugly because the things that they did to maintain power, a group like the Central Intelligence Agency should be either reformed or annihilated, because what happens with a group like that is they start to just take over a country. And so now we're looking at the FBI, coming in with Merrick Garland and targeting a political opponent. Even if you like this guy or don't like this guy, those types of things are so anti-constitutional that it is a constitutional crisis. And our response should be legal, and it should be high pressure. And it should be directly electoral come November as well. Because if they want to play this game, they're the ones who are in the game of hiding records. So if they want to target their political enemies and say, you have records, well, you know what? You're hiding the JFK records. You're hiding the UFO file. The public demands that you give that information up. Not through some phony process where you attach it to the NDAA and get an office to fight enemy aliens and put out phony Lou Elizondo and all this kind of stuff. Real actual disclosure. You won't get real actual disclosure from the government. Never happened. But the JFK records, there could be enough pressure to get those things out, and that would spell really big problem for the Central Intelligence Agency. That's a worthwhile project for our own history, for the truth, and to push back against this group that's taken too much power. And now the FBI, we know how guilty the FBI has been and all the crimes of J. Edgar Hoover when he was the head of it. That needs to be massively reformed. Look at all the things they got away with during the Trump administration. I mean, it's absurd. So, these agencies have been captured, and the way to kind of calling them out becomes very significant, I would say. And so that's my best advice. Yes.
We need a new Ron Paul is what we need. Actually,
that's true.
Yeah, there was a video that was circulating on Twitter this week where he was talking about eliminating all of these agencies in the first place. And it felt so refreshing.
Isn't that interesting? Because they just added 87,000 new IRS agents and $80 billion to the IRS right before they did this raid. So it's like, their whole thing is, hey, we'll do what we want, almost $800 billion for a bill on what? The climate? They're not doing anything for the climate. These are the guys who ruined the climate, right? So that's just a giveaway to their friends who are starting up green companies, So there needs to be a realization. And what they do is they keep people fighting, over ridiculous things, wokeism and all that nonsense, throw that stuff out and reform those schools. And, America has the opportunity, because right now we still have the Constitution operational. That has to be our rallying call. Oh, yes, Miss Olivia.
Karen Carpenter, in the interview last night with Dr. Farrell, it was mentioned that the raid on Trump ruled out DeSantis as a competitor. How? The public outcry around Trump?
Well, it's like what Ted Cruz said, basically, that no matter what anybody says in public, they're all waiting to see if Trump will announce. And so the fact that the FBI raid makes it a lot more likely that Trump will announce, because, if the deep state is openly going after Trump, it gives all of his supporters a rallying cry. One, but also it's such an egregious thing, because we do leave presidents alone, interestingly enough. I mean, they didn't even raid Richard Nixon, They set up a deal where they pardoned Nixon for anything that he had done in office, even with the Watergate outcry and all the rest. And, I think Nixon was largely set up at Watergate. So, this is something in American practice that, you're not allowed to go after your enemies if you're the regime in charge, to prosecute them with federal agencies. That is against the Constitution. It's an egregious affront to our constitutional republic. It spells the end of America if you allow that to take place. So they decided we're going to do it. Probably because, as I said, this thing about Cheney representing Hunter Biden and Hunter, making business deals through Romanian businessmen and meeting with his dad afterwards. This stuff may have been on the verge of coming out and they needed this. My feeling is that the UFO file aspect is overlooked because we also overlook the Space Force aspect. Trump, when he went into office, what did he do? He created the Space Force. No one else has done that. That's an attempt to bring that UFO file back under executive control. This goes back to Kennedy's attempt when he said the Central Intelligence Agency, here's NSAM 57. All of our counterintelligence covert operations go back to the Joint Chiefs, and the CIA is support. He was never able to get that ratified. And at the end of the Trump administration, after the election, there was a whole process where he ratified NSAM 57 that was floating around the corridors of the Pentagon, just hanging out because those guys were always afraid to enforce it against the CIA. So that was ratified. And interestingly enough, it went into effect January 7th. It was the day after J6. I'm sure as soon as Biden got back in, they reversed it. But, you never hear about that. Yes.
A cult fan. Just yesterday, on August 12th, 1943, the USS Eldridge tested time-space using Tesla coils and von Neumann calibrated generators. So basically, yesterday was the anniversary of the Philadelphia experiment in 1943. Wally Tango Foxtrot says Tesla walked out of the Philadelphia experiment, deeming it too dangerous. And you know what happened. And Rebel Alliance 77 says, just when you think Trump is in trouble, he turns it on the permanent government. Seems like a time war / reality war, like each side has a time turner / Palantir.
There's something interesting there about Trump, which is when he came into office, I remember this because they started to say all the guys like me that were out there, the alternative media, were all mouthpieces for Moscow all of a sudden. And the press was just going nuts. I've never seen people go barking nuts as they did when Trump got into office. And I've been watching them for a long time. I've been around that world for a number of years. And I never saw anything like 2016. They went crazy. And it was get Trump, and so they couldn't do it. So immediately they came out with this thing about fake news and how they had to take down all this stuff. And it became the great censorship wars against people who do what I do. But what's interesting is the fake news tag that they were trying to label all of the independent producers with. Trump turned it around because they were the news after all. And so he turned fake news around on them. There's an interesting quality with Trump, and they say that, he was close with Norman Vincent Peale and some of these New Thought people. I think it has something to do with that because it is kind of a Sun Tzu Art of War thing that it seems the more they throw at him, the more screwed up their situation becomes. And, for better or for worse, that seems to be what's going down. It is interesting. I would grant you that there does seem to be some extra agency operating around it all.
Well,
Yes.
It's like the Romulan bird of prey, right? It has to decloak in order to fire.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, no matter what you can say about Trump, he has exposed the deep state and they hate him for it.
Absolutely. My God. Excellent point. That thing about Romulans is interesting because, this idea that the deep state has to go to such lengths of exposing themselves to get him. They have to use the FBI to raid a president. Think about that. It's never been done in history. Not with Nixon, not with Clinton, not with Obama, and the weirdness, the gun running of Obama and the drone wars. With none of these people, even when Iran-Contra was going down, Reagan was in the middle of that. It was a huge problem. Nothing, there were no raids. Are you kidding me? You don't raid a president of the United States. It doesn't happen. So, because the idea is if the opposition party is in charge, then it's a political action and you can't use federal agencies for your own political purposes. That's how you get impeached and that's how you go to jail. So they don't care. They think the apparatus, the New York Times is with them and the tech companies are with them, and they'll censor anybody who fights it out. It's not going to work. There's an insane overreach that's involved. It's dangerous, and they're sick. But I would say that if they were trying to do this to, a different president from the past as well, it's a sickness of control that they need. Right now, the levels of illness on the left are really showing. They've gone nuts. And, people so often have always said, oh, the dictatorship will come from the right and all that. It's interesting. It turned out they were totally wrong, that it was the left that were the insane ones. They were the ones that the neocons were going to get behind. Now the left loves wars, right? They don't care about civil liberties, or they've become the very thing that they hated. And the left used to hate the FBI. Now they're like, all right, the FBI's got Trump, So say a prayer for those guys, because they've lost it.
It's power corrupts everybody.
Yes.
It was easy for all the kind of hippie
Right.
boomer students, in the 60s to hate the establishment. Now they are the establishment, and the establishment always wants to maintain power.
The hippies were all about free speech. They were the ultimate liberals. And those types of liberals, are very refreshing to look back on.
Absolutely.
None of the, can you imagine like the people of the Democrats of that generation, like Hubert Humphrey or RFK, rating a president and like, oh, the FBI is going to get you. It's American Gestapo, which is what Truman was worried about when the CIA development was hoisted upon him. And remember that a month to the day after the assassination of President Kennedy, he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, you either have to mend the CIA or end it, because I didn't create it for this. It's become a Frankenstein. And they flipped out. They tried to get him. They flew down. There's a story actually about Dulles flying down that night after the op-ed came out and telling him, you have to take this back. You can't say this about the CIA. And Truman said, I'm old. You can't scare me. It's not going to work. I'm not going to retract it. And so Dulles came out and said, well, we know that there's some mental faculty issues with Truman. Like he's got dementia, and this is even before Stepford Biden. All right. What do you got?
Give me 1 second to find it. Okay. So Jeff Whitaker, if they can do this to an ex-president, imagine what they have in store for you. Scarlet Fire says, in the USA, if you were accused of being a terrorist, then you have no constitutional rights. Be very careful. No due process. They can hold you indefinitely with no charges or right to see a lawyer. Shashakila says, do you think Trump has a fail-safe if he's arrested?
Oh, I think yeah. The first part of that whole thing relates to, the domestic terrorism bill they've tried to push. This is Merrick Garland and Biden. And the idea is, if you think, if you're not a leftist, basically, and you don't think with the regime, that you're dangerous. That's why parents are dangerous, because you want to make sure that the stuff they're doing to your kids over COVID is, under parental control. No. The state controls that. And we're going to give your 8-year-old kid a sex change operation behind your back. How do you like that? I mean, what they've done is they've gone into an insane loop. And so the question is, as they go over the cliff, it's just how many people are going to go over that cliff with them. But if the idea is to break up America over doing this, then it makes a lot of sense the way that they're pursuing things. However, I think it's a dangerous game on their side. And if that pendulum swings back, then we're going to see something dramatic in this country in relation to reestablishing the people's authority over those institutions. And I think it may come from citizen groups who become liaisons to Congress and the Senate, who are not under, there's no lobbyists and there's no corporate control. I think we're going to have to invent that. I think that's in the spirit of the original founding of the country. Yes.
Wendy Eater, does DJ believe there's any hope for the people of the USA to demand an end to the declaration of emergency and a return to the laws of the Constitution?
Look, this is the danger of the emergency powers. I pointed this out, but I want to do this. Like, in Canada, Justin Trudeau is so incredibly unpopular. He has a popularity of 22%. His group runs and rules with 29% of the vote from, after they break it off between the Conservatives and the other groups. 29%. That's what they're running with. And what it comes down to at the end of the day in their province there is 24,000 votes. That's it. So somebody like that already demonstrated. He came out with his speeches and he said, these people, who are protesting, they're probably misogynist and racist, and we shouldn't tolerate. There's no place for them. This is a leader of Canada, who probably most likely is Castro's son. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious,
isn't it?
Yeah, and there's a real good story for it. This isn't like a wild internet rumor. There's, his mother used to hang out with Castro.
Without any underwear.
Well, Pierre Trudeau is a weird guy anyway, but we know for a fact that that's very likely. And the only reason I mention it wouldn't matter, except that, Castro was this communist thug, and Trudeau aspires to be a communist thug. And his little weirdo deputy prime minister, Freeland, she's pretty weird too. She used to be in the pocket of Russian oligarchs. There's a lot of journalists who worked with her in the 90s, and that's where she was coming from. So something weird going on with this whole system. Of course, she's a big Soros biographer, and he sponsors her and the World Economic Forum. She's one of their leaders and all this kind of stuff. Look, it's a thick web, and I think for the most part, citizens have looked at people who've gotten strangely rich or crazy on the political side and just kind of winked at it and been like, the system will sort itself out. Now they're coming in for people. They're going after people. They're sending the FBI in to grab an ex-president, that 75 million people voted for. So people are looking at that and saying, well, if they can do that to Trump, are they going to do that to me? It's anti-constitutional. And so when we look at these things, we have to look at Trudeau and the fact that he pressed the emergency button during the trucker protest. And instead of working with the truckers on those issues, he used the emergency powers button because he can't govern with 22% of the vote. So all they can do is use emergency powers, which is basically the military and the power of the state. What do you think Biden is doing here? His poll numbers in the low 30s, probably worse. Those are favorable polls. You've got inflation at 1981 levels. You've got an economic disaster looming. You have the worst foreign policy that we've ever seen, probably, except for Bush. And but even Bush wouldn't be stupid enough to take on Russia. It's ridiculous. They're a nuclear country, and you're going to put NATO on their doorstep, and give billions of dollars to this idiotic regime in Ukraine. I mean, it's bizarre what's going on, leaving $85 million and soldiers behind in Afghanistan and letting the Taliban having $85 billion worth of our top stuff. It's a disaster. So Biden's a disaster, and he has a cognitive decline. So then what? What are you going to do? They know that. And I believe that on one stretch or another, that the thing that they're looking for is either a Biden-run emergency, state of emergency, or a continuity of government play. Continuity of government play, I think they get closer to when they have an opposition, like when Trump's in power, they tried to pull continuity of government. Continuity of government is so dangerous, and the fact that the Northcom commander was talking about UFOs recently. Let me tell you, I study these guys very closely. I always watch them to see if they'll ever mention UFOs. That's the first mention ever on record of UFOs by the Northcom commander, who becomes the combatant commander of the United States if they press the emergency button and say, hey, it's continuity of government because there's a disaster. And it doesn't have to be a nuclear disaster, right? Even though they're doing PSAs for these nuclear commercials. So we have to be aware of that. And that's why I point out General Van Herk. And the weirdness, again, you're surrounded by the UFO thing. General Van Herk comes out of what? He comes out of the 509th bombing squadron. What is the 509th bombing squadron? That's the same squadron that found the Roswell wreckage in 1947. That's weird linkage, very strange. And he's the first Northcom commander to mention the UFO file. For me, that's weird enough. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, one second. The desolate
Everyone,
one.
you're doing the Dark Journalist show here tonight. We're going deep with you on this special report, and it's all about the constitutional crisis and the classified UFO file. Where is all this taking us? I hope we've laid out some of that history involving Trump, Tesla, and Robert Sarbacher and the UFO file and how that plays into all this. We're going to take a few more of your questions here tonight. And I also want to remind you, go to that darkjournalist.com website, sign up for a free newsletter. That's there to keep us in contact in case we look at some really heavy duty social media shutdown. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I'm thanking someone. Hold on. Okay, so the desolate one. Is there any steganography in them announcing it was 15 boxes they found and they were all classified? Could it be the boxes Philip Corso was given from Roswell? If it was, remember what was in those boxes. And the Arts Collective says all of this info seems to point to the grand conclusion. Top secret clearances evolved in order to hush up alien interaction, which meshes with DJ's reports, re JFK wishing to release all the UFO stuff to the American public and the Russians.
Yeah, well, think of everything that happens in 60 years. So through that 60-year period, you go through the whole LBJ period, Vietnam, Nixon, Watergate, Jimmy Carter, stagflation, and the Reagan Revolution, and then Star Wars, SDI, but then Iran-Contra, and then Bush and Desert Storm, and then, Clinton and all the weird corruption, and the revelations about Mena, Arkansas, and the drug running, and the Clintons connected to the drug running, and then this incredible sweep of technology kind of artificially inflating the economy, and then them creating this phony derivatives to get us to 2008, past 9/11 and all the terror decade. And, then they go to the country and they say, to the Congress people, hey, there's going to be martial law if you don't give us billions and trillions of dollars to handle this mess that JP Morgan created around the globe by peddling phony money. So these are all the things that have happened in between. And then the Trump election, the press going completely savage and insane, the phony UFO threat through the CIA, the COVID op, all these different things. So that's all that gets filled in those periods. But the main problem, I think, gripped in the middle of the system is the piece about secrecy and the UFO file, because it lends itself to so much control in so many different areas. Because if they have advanced technology, if they know more about, if it's off-world visitors or whatever it happens to be, whatever it is, the X technology represents an advancement beyond the ordinary citizenry. But if you get too far above that citizenry, the situation becomes schizophrenic. And that's what we're looking at. And, so there's a cycle of disrespect between the leadership and the citizens, and now they're going after the citizens. So you see people who have observed things for a long time on all sides of the political spectrum. Naomi Wolf, who was a major leftist who ran the Clinton-Gore campaign, she can't believe the things that are going on. What are the shows that she goes on? She goes on Steve Bannon, right? Glenn Greenwald's a big leftist, right? And it's all the left. He's like, hey, wait, all the people who started the Iraq War and all the CIA people and all that, all the neocons, they're all the hosts and celebrated on MSNBC and liberal media, and they won't interview Greenwald because he calls them out. Guys like Matt Taibbi, those are all the leftists that are standing around and saying, what the hell happened here? Even shows like Bill Maher and stuff can't believe what's going on. It's an insane freak show. And it's getting even more freakier by the day. So this aspect, though, the secrecy aspect, their version of the UFO file is what they want to put out. And that's what you keep hearing about, phony Elizondo and Mellon peddling this junk, TTSA, Tom DeLonge, all that. It's all a phony attempt of the Central Intelligence Agency, which set up that company, the phony disclosure TTSA company. They set them up. They're the ones who put them on the map. Jim Semivan was a top person from the CIA directorate on record. You don't even have to say, well, they might be undercover agents or stuff. They're CIA people openly. And they're saying, oh, we want that truth on UFOs from the government. They are the government. They're liars. So the people in the UFO field need to call them out, not join forces with them. That's the dumbness that's been going on since 2017. And, we've missed out on 5 years since that bogus New York Times article came out with Elizondo as a whistleblower, and all that story got blown away. We did a lot of that blowing away on this program. And what I want to say is that that's 5 years wasted of real UFO research that could have gone on. All of the stuff that we're talking about, the Trump stuff, the JFK records, there could have been deep research going on about this. Instead, it was like, Elizondo mentioned there might be bodies. Ooh, and whenever somebody challenged Elizondo, weird like Twitter sock puppets would go after them. I mean, it's really freaky. When the CIA gets involved in this level and tries to control things, you get that impression that at the end of the day, they want to go back to the Davos meeting, to the Davos crowd and say, see, we got this, 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 and this. What pet treats do we get from you guys? Mm-hmm. That's what they're looking for. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Pet treats. Me on TV. So was Nixon ex-share or ex-protect? Rehoboth Farm says Nixon visited Mar-a-Lago a month before resigning. He went with Bibi Rebozo.
Yes.
And Nanette Christ said, I saw Nixon right before he resigned. We were asked to come pray and sing for him because he was considering suicide. He felt he was like the captain going down with the ship. Watergate was a trap.
Well, Nixon's a mixed bag, but you have to see him in context. This is the thing. So by the end, that apparatus, the deep state apparatus, wanted him out. And they made him even more paranoid. They played on all that. And it was a very dangerous situation. Now, what I think we can do when we look at Nixon is say, like, was he ex-share? Was he ex-protect? Well, he worked with all the ex-protect people, but by the early 70s, what is he doing? He's making his own documentaries about UFOs that he's going to put out. He is planning on using an alternative energy source that he's going to develop at Pine Gap. Now, that's on the record. Nobody knows what that is, but I think in light of the merit information and in light of some of the things we brought forward, that we can say his UFO, redevelopment program had reached a certain point and they were going to use an alternative energy source because in that period, the Arab 1973 oil embargo was driving the country into the ground. And that happened a few times in the 70s. So there was that control of, in the late 70s, it happened with Carter as well. So, that's deep state control. And so I think that Nixon was planning, supposedly now, to run for a third term as part of the bicentennial, using this alternative energy thing as a theme. And I think they were building up for disclosure. Look at Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1977. There's tons of UFO, it's in the zeitgeist of the time, and then it gets pulled off. They pull it aside again. And in the 80s, it comes up after Star Wars. And there's a big push at the end of the 80s for UFO disclosure. Reagan starts talking about if there was an alien threat at the UN, and Reagan knew a great deal about the UFO file. And Steven Spielberg visits the White House and plays E.T. And when it's over, Reagan stands up and says, people in this room know that that's not fiction. So there's a lot of unusual pieces in this puzzle, but I think that we can say that Nixon is a mixed bag, and he doesn't have the fire and the passion for freedom and breaking people free that Kennedy had. He is more of a calculated person, but by 1974, his calculations are, to get the UFO thing in the zeitgeist because he's making documentaries about it. So in that sense, he's more on the ex-share side at the end. Yes.
You know, I was just thinking, the problem is there are so many things that are wrong now that it's crippling, right? Nobody knows where to start. But
True.
so where would you start if there's one thing that we can do this fall? Because everybody needs to gather around one action that we can take.
Yeah. I mean, I see it as what it is. You have to fundamentally have a structure in place of ethics in your society. And so if people, like with the woke thing, are driving, uh, people over the edge, and then politically they are punishing their political enemies for standing up to them, and the regime is taking powers as they did during the lockdown, things of this nature, then they're subverting the nature of the constitutional republic that we live in. And so I think that the raid is a line in the sand that, we have to demand that the FBI and the Biden regime basically come clean on this thing, because otherwise, and I think there need to be prosecutions of the people who are trying to pull this off, because just like when they stopped the New York Post from broadcasting the Hunter Biden laptop, it's all about, see, it's a free flow of information. That's the thing that we're after. I guess that's the big rallying answer to what you're talking about, because with information we can make choices. If you don't have the information, it's hard to make the choice. So the whole thing is about removing the censorship. But when you have something that reaches past the Constitution, and we see this happening, even Democrats are jumping off on this and saying, you're going to have to explain, Merrick Garland, what you're doing prosecuting the opponent of the man you work for. That's a Soviet style system. It's a Stasi style approach. And the FBI is being used as an arm, as a thug arm, to destroy a politician that they don't like. It doesn't matter what you or I, which politics we share. That's wrong. And we can say that in relation to any ex-president, that it would be a sick thing just to go in and raid somebody. You can make a case against somebody, you can take them to trial, whatever, but to try to raid them and SWAT them, is intimidation. And that's your political opponent. That's your political opponent who's leading you in the polls. You can't do that. Those are Hitler, Stalin tactics. So they're turning us into a banana republic. My feeling is it's about the free flow of information and supporting those voices out here that are on your side, that are on your team. Because at the end of the day, it is a war. And so our team are the people who are fighting in an ethical fashion, judiciously, through the law, through information, through ideas, because that's at the end of the day where you're going to win. The idea, we've seen what they do with rallies and with provocations. They have so many provocateurs. If you ever read the story of Martin Luther King's crusades, it's interesting because the FBI threw tons of saboteurs in there to break windows and do all this kind of stuff. So they have a J6 in their back pocket at all times. They want this reaction. I think it's one of the reasons they did the raid, in fact. So my solution always is the transparency, breaking down the wall of secrecy. And in relation to the UFO file, blowing away the phony CIA threat disclosure thing and getting to the real thing. And if getting to the real thing is about us discovering it, then so be it. We don't really need the government for that. Yes.
Corinne Martin says leaders are selected, not elected. Voting machines are fraudulent. That's what I was thinking, is that if there's
paper
one
ballots
thing we have to get back to, it's paper ballots.
I would like to see it. I know some states have it on the ballot to go back to paper ballots. And I think that they should. It's not that there can't be fraud there, but the digital aspect makes it too tempting. And, we hear, again, the thing to watch is the emergencies, especially the phony emergencies. And the thing that they will try to use is the ability, there are emergencies, you can't go to your polling place, it's too dangerous. And turning that emergency thing, saying, hey, we'll use mail-in ballots. And that's how you got all the fraud last time. So what we need fundamentally is a more honest system. Now, I do think they're on notice. For example, in Arizona, the voting officials that got voted in were the people who raised red flags last time. So therefore, we're looking at something where there are changes, because Arizona was one of those weird cases last time where we didn't get a whole lot of answers, and Wisconsin's another one. So the way that I look at it is that's a state to state affair. We know fundamentally that in previous elections, if you win Florida and Ohio, that's pretty much it. Like the ball game's over. And that's been true now, I think, without exception, since JFK's election. So when that didn't happen, it made things a little bit interesting, shall we say. Go for it.
Ted Gunderson, it is all narrative to exercise the Patriot Act against the American people, all psychological operations creating strong division. I genuinely think they want a hot civil war. And Rebel Line 77, the elites will arrest Trump in a hope to spark an armed rebellion so COG can be enacted. Hence the feds arming and hiring 87,000 armed IRS agents.
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, I think the IRS thing is to squeeze. They're looking forward to squeezing what the middle class has left.
Naomi Wolflat the other night said that they are weaponizing being a Republican.
Yes, right. If you are a Republican. But here's an interesting thing for us to keep in mind about all of this, which is some of what you were saying there in that question is true. Because if they can get an emergency, they keep trying to push for this, like, oh, there's an emergency because people are saying something against law enforcement. Look, if a group, these are the same people who were supporting, like, defund the police and go after the police, right? And we're blowing up cities and all the rest of it. So it's just what they can do on their side to cause chaos. And then they want to project that onto the other side. So they talk about, oh, there's white supremacy and all this kind of stuff. Look, you've always had it, and if anything, it's gone down. The numbers of those groups have gone down. But you've always had black supremacists, white supremacists, Chinese militant. It's there. They're always there. That you're always going to have them in a democratic republic. You're not going to be able to avoid that. However, what you're suggesting there, Biden administration, is that anybody who thinks differently than you is a terrorist or a white supremacist, and that's BS. And they know it. So they just want enough of a tagline so that they can attack the population. It's true. Now, I also think it's very important how the population plays against the establishment, because they can mess themselves up in a way better without an overreaction on the public side. So I would say what the public needs to do is push back, as I said, judiciously, and push back electorally in a legal fashion and through word of mouth. Look, what we do in the ideas room here and the things we're talking about, this is so important because this is the thing that they're trying to avoid, which is open, honest sharing of ideas, because that's the thing that ultimately they can't really pull this off if we're doing that. The Enabling Act in 1934 that allowed Hitler to become the dictator, they were only able to pull that off through the idea that the communists had burned down the Reichstag, right? But with a real flow of information and the kind of research and things that we can do online in a heartbeat, it's much harder to pull that off. But I think we have to be on guard for it. And I think the election in November needs to change things fundamentally. So we have to keep speaking and opening up minds about this and talking about taboo subjects like the UFO file, but not with CIA UFO threat talking points. The UFO file plays into this. And if they're talking about it, then we're talking about it. Okay, we'll take two more questions.
Dow Jones Mueller, whatever happened to Uncle Trump?
He died. He was living in Watertown, which is maybe about 10 minutes from here. And
does he die an old man?
He was 73.
Okay.
And he got the Presidential Medal of Honor from Reagan in the 80s, another Presidential Medal of Honor from Truman way back when, 1947. This guy was incredibly well decorated on the science front. And, it's interesting because I made that little expedition out to MIT a few years ago. And we went actually over there, and we were looking for the John Trump information, and it was in Box X, interestingly enough. And there was nothing in there, in fact. So what they had held out on, all the good stuff had been taken out a long, long time ago. But just the fact that the X steganography was part of the record there was exceptional. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special report, gone deep, deep tonight. And it's with a hopeful glance toward the future that by exposing these things, we can take a lot of the fire out of what they're trying to do. I do want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, because that keeps us in touch, and also is just very important with all the shutdown of social media that we've seen. Although I'm going to try as much as I can to operate on all these platforms, and I certainly enjoy being on these platforms with you. And so hopefully we are able to continue to do that. But what the newsletter does is it guarantees that regardless of what happens, you're going to be able to have that information, and you're going to want to stand up and be counted. That's a free newsletter, but it's going to keep you well informed about the incredible shows, X-series shows, and interviews, guests, and documentaries that we have coming up for you. Miss Olivia, the last question of
Okay, I have to ask this. Me on TV, what is DJ's favorite old school UFO book?
Oh, go back and find the Susie Smith books. They're very strange, very unusual stories. I don't know if anyone really figured out what was going on with Susie Smith, but she was very interesting. But John Keel, I would say John Keel's early works on the Men in Black, the Eighth Tower books, those are quite remarkable, and some of my all-time favorites. I think certainly, the Mac books are fascinating for understanding the abduction phenomena, but just for the stories themselves. The Keel books are interesting because, he shows up to one house and he's like, "Oh, I'm here to talk to you about, the UFO sighting that you had." And they were like, "Yeah, it's interesting you came back." And he was like, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you're just here yesterday." So I love a lot of that. Frank Edwards' work is interesting also. And what's weird, I think, is that Frank Edwards had a deep relationship with Harry Truman, and he wrote all about the Men in Black and the secrecy around the UFO file. And then he died of a cerebral hemorrhage in right after he wrote the Men in Black book in 1965. So there was something interesting about Edwards' work as well. But I also think that Frank Scully's early work and that whole case around the Aztec UFO is early interference by the FBI and the UFO file. Crucial information. Morris Jessup's case for the UFO. Those are some really kind of classic books. Yes.
If someone was really just entering the UFO topic for the first time, if they're real newbie, where should they start?
Well, all of the Stanton Friedman interviews that I have on this channel, the late Stanton Friedman, the late Paul Hellyer, was the former defense minister of Canada, the late Jim Marrs, and the fascinating Alien Agenda book and the interviews that we did. All that is quite remarkable, and I think holds up dramatically well. In particular, I think that Friedman was able to come in from a research level that was very official. And so I like his work. I mean, some of the earlier works, like Timothy Good and Above Top Secret and all that, those are kind of 90s classics. But what's interesting and real fascinating book I'd recommend, it's not often talked about, but it is Betty Hill's book, about UFOs, and it's called A Common Sense Approach to UFOs, because people don't realize that she had sightings all through her life after that initial phase and period where she had those experiences with Barney Hill. And I think it's very interesting. She reveals a lot in there, including the fact that most of the sightings take place by water. And with that, Miss Olivia.
Okay, I have so many people to thank.
Yes.
Okay. A cult fan, Gil and Joy R, Jordan Banner, Stephen, R.E.L. McCoy, and Gummy Bears, Eurythmia's Fun, Ken is Gone, Global Atlantis, Catherine Swayze, James Fife, Dantic Lichtenstein, The Weed in Your Garden, Doreen Hewitt, Jim Sarge 3ID, Lisa Frequency, Sherry 333, John T. Lundy Jr., W.C. Ray, Floor A, Housatonic Live, Bobo the Clown, Sarah Jane, Robert Scott, Shatanga Tang, Stefan Vanderlaan, Robert Mearns, Bo Krills, Scott Henry, Kevin Kelso, Erica Swenson Elliott, Carol Crumlish, John F., Bob Bindert, Karen Carpenter, Wait a Minute 72, Havardian, Wolfgang McCarthy, Jennifer Walters, Shashakila, Chrissy, and Litty Lou. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Unbelievable. Wow. What great support from you guys tonight. Really appreciate it. You help us to bring you these important reports, and we couldn't do it without you. And I'll say that to all our subscribers as well, but we really appreciate it. And having you here with us in the Ideas Room, just fantastic. Olivia, you did an amazing job. Round of applause. Thank you very much. And I'll do a couple of shout outs here. Let's see. SOS. I like that. Great show, Daniel and Olivia. Great group tonight. I agree. Catherine Harris. Oh, Dolores Cannon. You know, I met Dolores Cannon. Interesting lady. Scarlet Fire. I feel I've destroyed my country. Woodrow Wilson. Oh, yeah. He didn't want to go along with the Federal Reserve Act. Unbelievable. And, it's interesting. I will say this about Woodrow Wilson, which is Casey has a number of very positive things to say about him. And he brought Casey into the White House to do a series of readings to lay out the famous 14 points. Very interesting. That's one. Witch 76. Awesome show as usual. Thank you guys. Thank you very much for being with us. Jane's Doe, Rose Belizia, Havardian, Sekhmet, Max Lupo, Divine Appointment. Wow. I know Kate's out there. I saw Carly out there earlier. Did she show up again? She's very good to see you. Dalval, good night, good people. Indeed. It's great to have everyone here. Holy smoke. I like that. My third show. Wow. Chrissy, it's great to see you. DJ, what do you think of the meteorite over Utah this morning? I thought it was a bomb going off. I heard something about that. I'd like to get more info about it and why they know for a fact it's a meteorite. But that's interesting. You heard it. If you have any details about it, email me at dj@darkjournalist.com. I'd love to hear it. And but Utah, that's one. A lot of interesting cases over in Utah, and I feel like it's just very old and very sacred place. I love that one name. Bo Krills. Making it happen. Great show again, DJ and Olivia. Astro Sam. Thank you, Astro Sam. It's great to have you out there. Fantastic. Let's see who else we got. Karen Carpenter. Wonderful week to be a member of the Ideas Room. Thanks so much. Yeah, we were lucky. We had some, we had a midweek show earlier. I think it was Tuesday. And then we had Dr. Farrell, just outstanding. Dr. Farrell Part 2 is coming out shortly, and we have some more guests for you. We're probably going to get Farrell back, especially if they get that affidavit out, which, by the way, they never have to get the affidavit out, which is a real bummer. And they probably won't because it'll reveal the game too early. Four Corners, exactly. That's the one. Ravelon 1. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. Loved the Joseph Farrell piece yesterday. Yes, I highly recommend that show. and the Mar-a-Lago MacGuffin. Farrell at his best, as it were. And we're going to have some great people. We'll have Gigi Young back very shortly and some exciting guests. And we'll see what Gigi has to say about all this. Silver Fox, love you guys. We love you too. And with that, everyone, I'm going to let you go. Catherine Harris, it's great to see you. Jennifer Walters, wow, great crew, great familiar faces in the ideas room tonight. We will see you all next week, and we may have some very interesting, exciting reports. In the meantime, Dr. Farrell looked great. I agree, Stephanie. He's right back where he was. He's coming back strong. Fantastic. We are winning freedom, baby. Ivan Langley. That's a good quote of the night. We will see you all next week, and we may have some special reports coming up with all the wildness that's going on. And one thing I can say for sure is, I'm keeping a very close eye on all the aspects around the Trump case. And I think there's a small window for them to pull back on this, and otherwise they're committed all the way. And if they're committed all the way, then it's going to be something else, and we'll definitely be covering it. And we're hoping for justice to prevail in that situation. And we don't want to see citizens of this country prosecuted by any institution or any regime, especially not their political opponents. We believe in the Constitution and the rule of law, and that's hopefully what we're all going to get. Have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you soon. And like they say, end broadcast.
But it never really ends.
It never really ends. Come on. Good night, everyone.